Hello everyone, and welcome back to xranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still don't know what to make of what happened back in '97. It's been over 25 years now, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. The image of those tracks is burned into my brain. It was November 15th, 1997. I remember the date because it was the weekend before Thanksgiving, and we were trying to get in one last outing before the holiday chaos and winter weather really set in. I'd convinced my wife Linda and her sister Kate to go hunting for arrowheads with me in Beaver County, Utah. It was something I'd done since I was a kid, and I knew all the good spots where the Paiute and other tribes had camped centuries ago. The morning started normal enough. We drove out in my old Ford pickup to a remote area I'd been to many times before. It was chilly, probably in the mid-40s, but the sun was bright, making it perfect weather for hiking around. We had packed sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, and plenty of water. I brought my usual day pack with a small shovel, brushes, and bags for anything we might find. I've spent my whole life in those mountains. My dad taught me to hunt when I was 8, and I've hiked every trail and off-trail area you could imagine in that county. I know what deer tracks look like: elk, bear, mountain lion. Hell, I can even tell you if it was a jackrabbit or a cottontail just from the prints. What I found that day, though, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. We'd been out for about 3 hours, working our way up a shallow ravine where runoff sometimes exposed artifacts. Linda and Kate were about 30 yards ahead of me. I was taking my time, scanning the ground carefully like I always do. That's when I heard Linda call out, "Sam! Sam, come look at this!" There was something in her voice, not quite fear, but definitely confusion. I hurried over to where they were standing, near a small cedar tree that couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall. "What is it?" I asked as I approached. Linda pointed at the ground. "What made that?" At first I thought maybe they'd found an arrowhead or pottery shard, but then I saw what she was pointing at. There, in the dirt, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen. It was shaped vaguely like a human foot, elongated with a heel and a forward section, but that's where the similarity ended. This thing was huge. I wear a 10.5 cowboy boot, and when I placed my foot next to it for comparison, this print was easily the same length as my entire boot, with what looked like toes, extending another 7 to 9 inches beyond. The width was even more shocking, easily 8 or 9 inches across. And it wasn't just the size that was strange. The print was pressed about 1/2 inch into the hard earth, which meant whatever made it was heavy, really heavy. But the detail that made my skin crawl was that it only had 3 toes. 3 large, clearly defined toes splayed out at the front of the print. Not 5 like a human, not 4 like a bear, 3. I crouched down to examine it more closely. The edges were crisp, not weathered or washed out. This wasn't some old track. It had been made recently, probably earlier that same day. "What the hell is it, Sam?" Kate asked, her voice slightly higher than normal. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never seen anything like this." And I hadn't. 25 years of hunting, hiking, and tracking in these mountains, and I'd never come across anything remotely similar. I started looking around the area, scanning for more prints. About 12 feet away, I found another one, though it wasn't as clearly defined as the first. The stride length alone was unsettling. I'm 6'1", and when I tried to match the stride, I had to stretch uncomfortably far. Linda had gone quiet, which wasn't like her. When I looked up, her face was pale. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded but didn't speak. Kate moved closer to her sister. I went back to the first print and started really analyzing it. The more I looked, the more unnerved I felt. Whatever made this was bipedal, walking on 2 legs like a human, but the dimensions were all wrong. Based on the depth of the impression and what I know about tracking, this thing had to weigh at least 500 pounds, maybe more. Then I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. The cedar tree next to the print was directly between the two tracks I'd found. The tracks were positioned in such a way that whatever made them must have stepped completely over the tree without breaking stride. Let me be clear about what that means. This thing took a normal step for it that carried it over a 5-foot tree. The stride length combined with the height needed to clear the tree meant we were looking at something at least 8 or 9 feet tall. "We should go," Linda said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." I wanted to tell her she was overreacting, but I couldn't, because the truth was, I felt it too, a deep, primal unease that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the warm sun. "Just give me a minute," I said. "I want to see if there are more tracks." I started making a wider circle around the area, scanning the ground carefully. About 20 yards away, I found what might have been a third print, though it was much fainter, just barely visible in a patch of softer soil. The direction suggested whatever made these tracks was heading deeper into the hills, away from the roads and any cabins. As I was examining this third print, I heard it, a sound that I still can't adequately describe. It wasn't quite a howl, not exactly a scream, but something in between. It came from the direction the tracks were heading, probably a half-mile away at least, but it carried through the clear mountain air like it was much closer. I've heard elk bugle, coyotes howl, mountain lions scream. This wasn't any of those. It was deeper, more resonant, and frankly, more deliberate sounding, like it knew we were there. When I turned around, Linda and Kate were already halfway back to the truck. I didn't blame them. I took one last look at the tracks, then hurried after them. "What was that?" Kate asked when I caught up. "Mountain lion, probably," I lied. "It wasn't a mountain lion." I knew that with complete certainty. We got back to the truck, and I could see both women were shaken. Hell, I was shaken too. I suggested we try another spot a few miles away, thinking it would help take our minds off what we'd found. But Linda just shook her head. "I want to go home, Sam," she said quietly. I didn't argue. As we drove back down the dirt road toward the highway, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The rational part of my brain told me I was being ridiculous, but something more primitive kept my eyes flicking back to that mirror every few seconds. We were about a mile from where we'd parked when Linda suddenly gasped and pointed out her window. "There! Did you see it?" I slammed on the brakes, sending up a cloud of dust around us. "See what?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something big, moving between those trees." I looked where she was pointing, at a stand of pines about 100 yards off the road. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows, making it hard to distinguish details. "I don't see anything," I said, but I kept staring, searching the tree line. Then I saw it, or rather, I saw something. A dark shape, much taller than the surrounding brush, moving with surprising grace for its size. It was only visible for a second or two before it disappeared behind the trees, but that was enough. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen. Not a bear's lumbering gait, not a deer's bouncing stride. This was smooth, deliberate, and fast. "Drive, Sam," Kate said from the back seat, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need to be told twice. I hit the gas harder than I meant to, fishtailing slightly on the dirt road before straightening out. We drove in complete silence for several minutes, the only sound the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. "What was that thing?" Linda finally asked. "I don't know," I said again, and I hated how helpless those words made me feel. I've always been the guy with the answers, especially when it comes to the outdoors. But this was beyond my experience. As we turned onto the paved road that would take us back to town, I felt some of the tension leave my body. Civilization, even the small-town version we had in Beaver County, felt safe and normal compared to what we'd just experienced. But then Kate spoke up from the back seat. "Do you smell that?" I did. A strong, musky odor had filled the cab of the truck. It wasn't the usual pine-scented air that came through the vents when driving in the mountains. This was pungent, almost rancid, like wet fur mixed with something I couldn't identify. "Roll up your window," I told Linda, reaching to close mine as well. The smell lingered even with the windows shut. I flipped on the air conditioning, hoping it would clear out whatever had seeped in. "It was on the road," Linda said suddenly. "When we were stopped, it must have been close enough for the smell to get in." The thought made my stomach clench. If that thing had been close enough for its scent to get into the truck, it had been much closer than what we'd glimpsed in the trees. We drove straight home without stopping. None of us felt like talking. When we got back, I made a half-hearted joke about our adventure, trying to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the day in my mind, those enormous three-toed prints, the sound that carried through the mountains, the dark shape moving with such unnatural fluidity, and that smell. The next morning, I called my buddy Mike, who worked for the Forest Service. I tried to sound casual as I described finding some unusual tracks, and asked if there had been any reports of strange animals in the area. "What kind of unusual?" he asked. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "Big. Bigger than a bear print, but different. Looked almost human-shaped, but with only 3 toes. There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Mike said, "You're the 3rd person this month to report something like that." My blood ran cold. Who else? Couple of hunters up near Merchant Valley saw tracks, and a family camping by 3 creeks said they heard strange noises all night and found their campsite ransacked in the morning. Nothing taken, just tossed around. I wanted to ask more, but something held me back. Putting it into words made it more real somehow. "Probably just a bear with a deformed paw," Mike suggested, not sounding convinced himself. "Yeah, probably," I agreed. "But it wasn't a bear. I've tracked more bears than I can count, and no bear on earth makes tracks like what we saw. No bear steps over 5-foot trees in a single stride. No bear moves the way that Shadow moved through the trees." I never told anyone else about what we found that day. Linda and Kate and I have an unspoken agreement not to bring it up. But sometimes, when I'm out in those mountains alone, I find myself scanning the tree line, listening for that sound again, and watching the ground for those 3-toed prints. Whatever it was, it's still out there. I'm sure of it. And sometimes on clear, quiet nights when the wind is right, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that strange, musky odor, even with all the windows closed. Story 2. I still can't believe it's been nearly 20 years since that day on Boundary Peak, July 12th, 2004. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. I've spent a lifetime in law enforcement, 19 years with Nevada PD at that point. And I've seen some shit that would turn most people's stomachs. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I saw on that mountain. It was supposed to be a normal climbing trip. Me and my 2 college buddies, Mark and Steve, had been planning it for months. We'd been roommates back in the day and tried to get together for at least one adventure each year. This time we picked Boundary Peak, the highest point in Nevada at 13,140 feet. Not the most technical climb, but challenging enough for 3 middle-aged guys who spent most of their time behind desks now. The weather that day was perfect. Clear blue skies, temperature in the mid-60s at elevation, slight breeze. We'd gotten an early start, hitting the trail around 6 in the morning. The climb was going well, we were making good time, stopping occasionally to catch our breath and snap a few photos of the landscape. By about 2 in the afternoon, we were approaching the summit. That's when we encountered 2 other climbers coming down. Nothing unusual about that. Boundary Peak gets its fair share of hikers during summer months. We pulled off to the side of the narrow trail to let them pass, standard courtesy on the mountain. While we were waiting, I glanced over at the ridgeline connecting Boundary Peak to Montgomery Peak. There was a lone climber over there, picking his way carefully along the ridge. As I watched, he dislodged a rock that went tumbling down the west side of the mountain. Nothing major. Happens all the time when you're on loose terrain. but something about that falling rock drew my attention to the bowl-shaped slope about 300 feet below us. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought maybe it was another hiker, but within seconds I knew I was looking at something different. There was a figure moving across that slope at a speed that made no damn sense. Anyone who's ever hiked across loose shale and boulder fields knows you have to pick your way carefully. One wrong step and you're looking at a twisted ankle at best, a lethal fall at worst. But this thing that was covering ground like it was running on a track. "Hey," I said, nudging Mark. "Look down there." All 5 of us, me, my 2 buddies, and the 2 climbers we'd stopped for, ended up watching this figure for a good 2 minutes. Nobody said a word. We just stared. The way it moved was what really got to me. It would run upright on 2 legs for maybe 20 or 30 yards, then suddenly drop down on all 4s when it hit rough terrain. After crawling over the obstacles, it would stand back up and continue running. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know how humans move when they're in a hurry across difficult terrain. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. Based on the landscape and the boulders around it, I estimated the figure was between 5 to 5.5 feet tall. Not particularly big, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down to knee level when it was upright. The head and upper body were covered in what looked like long hair or fur, darker and thicker around the head and face. The coloring was mostly light brown or tan, but with these darker patches around the head and what I'd guess was the groin area. I've spent my entire adult life observing people, reading body language, noticing details. It's part of being a cop, and every instinct in my body was screaming that what I was looking at wasn't human. The figure eventually reached the tree line and disappeared into the forest below. We all just stood there for a moment, trying to process what we'd seen. "What the hell was that?" Steve finally asked, breaking the silence. Nobody had an answer. I turned to the 2 climbers who were heading down. "Where you guys from?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Southern California," one of them replied. He looked pale. Did you see that thing down there?" I nodded. "Yeah. Any idea what it might have been?" They both shook their heads. The taller one said, "Never seen anything move like that before." After they continued down, we decided to push on toward the summit. My mind was racing. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over, trying to make sense of it. Bear, no way. Wrong proportions, wrong movement pattern. Mountain lion, absolutely not. This thing was walking upright. Hiker in distress, the speed and the way it moved ruled that out completely. When we reached the top, we ran into that lone climber I'd seen on the ridge earlier. He'd made it to the summit before us. While Mark and Steve were taking summit photos, I casually asked him if he'd seen anything unusual down in the bowl. "No," he said, looking confused. "Should I have?" I just shrugged it off. Just thought I saw someone down there having a tough time. Here's the thing that still bothers me to this day. All 3 of us had cameras. Good ones too. This was before smartphone cameras were any good, so we had actual digital cameras. But they were packed away in our backpacks. By the time any of us thought about grabbing one, the figure was almost to the tree line. I made the split-second decision to keep watching rather than look away to dig out my camera. I didn't want to miss a second of whatever it was I was seeing. That decision has haunted me for years. No proof, just our word. The rest of that day was bizarre. We barely talked about it on the way down, like we were all processing it separately. The hike back to our vehicles felt different, tense, hyper-aware. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure again. Every rustling bush, every distant movement caught my eye. The wilderness suddenly felt less familiar, less safe. That night at camp, we finally discussed it over beers. "You guys know I'm not prone to exaggeration," I said. "In my line of work, observation is everything, and what I observed today doesn't fit any explanation I can come up with." Mark nodded slowly. "The arms were what got me. Too long, And the way it moved between upright and all fours, that was fluid, natural. Like it was designed to move that way. Steve had been the most skeptical initially, but even he couldn't dismiss what we'd seen. I kept thinking it must be a bear, but bears don't run upright like that. Not for that distance, not that fast. We talked about reporting it, but who would we even tell? It wasn't an emergency. We hadn't been threatened. And without photo evidence, we'd sound like three middle-aged guys who'd had too much altitude and not enough oxygen. So we did nothing. Packed up the next morning and drove home. Back to our normal lives and jobs where things made sense. Years later, around 2009, I ended up purchasing some land not far from Boundary Peak. Beautiful property, remote, peaceful, perfect place to eventually retire. While getting to know my neighbors, I met an older guy named Frank who'd lived in the area his whole life. One evening, after a few whiskeys on my porch, I finally worked up the courage to tell Frank about what I'd seen that day on the mountain. I expected him to laugh it off or change the subject. Instead, he got real quiet. "You're not the first," he said finally, staring into his glass. "Old Bill Gregory, he used to prospect these hills back in the 90s, came into town one day, white as a sheet. Said he'd seen something in the forest that scared him so bad he abandoned his claim. Never went back, never talked details, but he wasn't the same after." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. Did he describe what he saw? Frank shook his head. "Nope, just said it wasn't natural, wasn't right." He moved away about a month later. I've gone back to Boundary Peak a few times since then, always with a camera ready, always scanning that same bowl-shaped slope. I've never seen it again, but I know what I saw that day. I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't a person. Some nights I still wake up thinking about how that thing moved, that unnatural fluid shift from 2 legs to 4 and back again. The way it navigated terrain that should have slowed it to a crawl. Those impossibly long arms. I've spent my entire career dealing in facts, evidence, things I can prove. But the most unsettling experience of my life left me with nothing but my word and the matching accounts of 4 strangers who saw the same thing I did. I don't know what it was that we saw on Boundary Peak that day, but I know it was real. And I know it's still out there, moving through those mountains in ways nothing should be able to move, watching hikers who have no idea they're being watched. And that's what keeps me up at night. Story 3. I still get chills thinking about what happened that day in Sullivan County. It's been 20 years now, but when I close my eyes, I can see it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. My buddy Dan and I were taking a drive west on Route 42 back in October of 2004. It was one of those perfect fall afternoons in Pennsylvania. Not too cold yet, but the leaves were changing. Lots of reds and oranges mixed with the evergreens. I remember we'd been to a concert the night before in Scranton and were heading back toward LaPorte, just taking our time, windows down, talking about nothing important. We were about 15 miles outside of LaPorte, in this stretch where the road narrows and tall pines and maples crowd in on both sides. The sunlight was flickering through the branches, making these weird patterns on the road. I was driving my old Ford Ranger, this beat-up blue thing I'd had since high school, and Dan was messing with the radio, trying to find something besides static. "Man, reception out here sucks," he said. And I remember laughing about how we were probably the only humans for miles. We weren't really, of course, but that's how it felt on that empty stretch of road. I wasn't going very fast, maybe 40 or 45 miles per hour, when something caught my eye ahead of us. At first I thought it was just shadows moving across the road, but then I realized it was something physical, something big. "Holy shit," I said, and Dan looked up just in time to see it. About 50 yards ahead of us, this thing came crashing through the weeds on the left side of the road. I immediately slowed down, not knowing if it would stop in the middle of the road or what. But it didn't stop. It moved across the asphalt with this bizarre loping gait and disappeared into the woods on the right side. What the fuck was that? Dan said, twisting in his seat to look back. I kept driving but slowed down even more as we approached the spot where it had crossed. I don't know, man. A bear, maybe? But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in my life. Growing up in Pennsylvania, you get used to them. This was different. The way it moved was all wrong. It was on all fours, but not like any four-legged animal I've ever seen. Its front limbs were unnaturally long, and it would stretch them way out in front of its body. Then the shorter back legs would push it forward in these uneven bounds. It didn't run smoothly like a deer or lope like a bear. It was more like galloping, but awkward and jerky. As we passed the spot where it had crossed, this smell hit us. Even with the windows just partially down, it was overwhelming. A musty, rotting stench that made my eyes water. Dan actually gagged and rolled his window up. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "You smell that?" I nodded, rolling my window up too. What the hell could smell that bad? I slowed down even more, almost to a crawl, both of us staring into the woods on the right, where it had disappeared. The trees were thick there, but for just a second, I thought I saw movement, just a flash of black between the trunks. "Stop the truck," Dan said suddenly. "I want to see if we can spot it again." I hesitated. Something in my gut was screaming at me not to stop, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder and put the truck in park, engine still running. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, but Dan was already leaning forward, squinting into the woods. "I just want to see what it was," he said. "Come on, we'll just look from the road." We sat there for a minute, both of us scanning the tree line. The woods were quiet, too quiet now that I think about it. No birds, no rustling, nothing. "Let's get out for a minute," Dan suggested. "Just to the edge of the road." Every instinct told me to stay in the truck, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. So I turned off the engine, and we both got out, standing at the edge of the asphalt, peering into the trees. The smell was even stronger outside, that same rotting, musty odor that seemed to coat the back of my throat. I remember thinking it smelled like a combination of wet dog, decomposing vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. Something unnatural. "I don't see anything," I said after a minute. "Let's go, man. This place gives me the creeps." Dan didn't respond right away. He was staring intently at something in the woods. "Mike," he said finally, his voice low, "what does a bear's coat look like to you?" "What do you mean?" "That thing wasn't a bear," he said. "Its fur was all wrong. Did you see it?" I hadn't consciously processed it until he mentioned it, but he was right. The creature was covered in this long, tangled black hair that didn't look like a bear's coat at all. It was matted with dirt and twigs, with actual clumps of mud hanging from its sides. In some places it looked patchy, like it had some kind of skin condition. "Yeah," I said slowly. "And did you notice it didn't have a tail or ears that I could see? Just this low, rounded head." Dan nodded. "No snout either, at least not one I could make out from that distance." We stood there in silence for a moment, both trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Then we heard it. A cracking sound from the woods, like a branch breaking under weight. Then another. Something was moving in there, coming back toward the road. "Get in the truck," I said, not taking my eyes off the tree line. "Now." We both scrambled back into the cab, and I started the engine with shaking hands. As I put it in drive, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, something dark shifting between the trees on the left side of the road now, behind us. "It crossed back over," Dan said, twisting around in his seat. "How the hell did it get over there so fast?" I didn't answer, just hit the gas harder than I meant to, causing the tires to spin briefly before catching. The truck lurched forward, and I didn't slow down until we were several miles away. We didn't talk much for the next few minutes, both lost in our thoughts. Finally, Dan broke the silence. "What do you think it was?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. Not a bear, not a deer. Too big for a dog or coyote. Too weird for any of those," Dan agreed. The way it moved, those proportions weren't right. Over the next few days, we told a few people about what we'd seen. Most just shrugged it off or tried to explain it away. Someone suggested it might have been a feral hog, though those weren't common in our area at the time. Another person said it was probably just a mangy bear with some kind of disease that affected its gait. Someone else thought maybe it was a sick dog or some other animal with rabies. But none of those explanations felt right. They didn't account for the strange way it moved, the unusual proportions of its limbs, or the lack of distinguishable features on its head. And they certainly didn't explain how it seemed to circle back around us so quickly, crossing from one side of the road to the other without us seeing it. About a week later, Dan came over to my apartment with his laptop. He'd been researching online and found some accounts of Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, where the creature was described as moving on all fours rather than upright. "Look at this," he said, showing me a forum where people shared their encounters. This guy in Lycoming County described almost the exact same thing we saw. Long front limbs, shorter back legs, moving in bounds across the road. I read through the account, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The description matched what we'd seen almost perfectly, right down to the matted fur and the awful smell. "So you think we saw some kind of Bigfoot?" I asked, the words sounding ridiculous as they left my mouth. Dan shrugged. "I don't know what to call it. All I know is what we saw wasn't any normal animal." In the years since, I've gone back and forth about what we encountered that day. Sometimes I try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear with mange or some other condition. Maybe the strange gait was due to an injury. Maybe the weird proportions were just a trick of the light or our imaginations filling in gaps. But deep down, I know better. Whatever crossed that road in front of us wasn't something that has a name in any wildlife guide. Its movements were too deliberate, too strange, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I remember the way it seemed to circle back around behind us, how it moved from one side of the road to the other so quickly and quietly, almost like it was hunting. I haven't been back to that stretch of Route 42 since that day. Dan moved to Ohio a few years later, but we still talk about it sometimes when we catch up on the phone. Neither of us has ever seen anything like it again, and part of me hopes we never do. But the other part of me wishes I'd gotten a better look, or maybe even taken a picture. Because to this day, I lie awake sometimes wondering what exactly it was that we saw galloping across that road in Sullivan County. And even more unsettling, wondering if it saw us too, and if somewhere in those Pennsylvania woods it remembers us as well. The strangest part. About a month after our encounter, I was reading the local paper and saw a small article about hikers finding mutilated deer carcasses in the woods near where we had our sighting. The article mentioned the animals had been torn apart in an unusual manner that didn't match typical predator behavior. The rangers blamed it on coyotes, but after what I saw, I'm not so sure. I still get that feeling in the pit of my stomach when I think about it. That thing wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't supposed to be real, but I saw it, clear as day, in broad daylight. And sometimes, when I'm driving on a wooded road and catch a glimpse of movement in the trees, I can't help but tense up, wondering if I'm about to see those long, awkward limbs come crashing through the underbrush again. Story 4. I still can't make sense of what I saw last summer. I'm not the type who believes in cryptids or goes looking for Bigfoot. I'm just a regular guy who likes hiking and being outdoors. I've lived in central Pennsylvania most of my life, so I know these woods pretty well. But what happened on June 18th, 2020 has stuck with me, and I need to get it off my chest. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had taken the day off work to scout some new trails near Bald Eagle State Forest. The weather was perfect, sunny around 75 degrees, just a light breeze. I'd been feeling cooped up from all the COVID lockdown stuff, so I was really looking forward to finding a new hiking spot away from crowds. I was driving along Route 192 near Center Hall in my old Subaru Forester, windows down, just enjoying the fresh air. The road there winds through some pretty dense forest with occasional marshy areas. Nothing unusual about the day up to that point. I had my trail maps on the passenger seat and a coffee in the cup holder. Normal stuff. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was coming around this gentle curve in the road, going maybe 40 miles per hour, when I spotted something moving on the roadside to my right. My first thought was groundhog. We get tons of them around here, especially near the road edges. But something about the movement caught my attention. It wasn't right. Groundhogs don't move like that. As I got closer, I realized this thing was way too big for a groundhog, maybe a raccoon, but in broad daylight. And then, just as I was passing by, I got a quick glimpse that made me slam on the brakes. Whatever it was stood upright on 2 legs. It was small, I guess around 3 feet tall, but definitely standing like a person. My heart started racing. I checked my rearview mirror, but the curve in the road blocked my view of where the creature had been. There wasn't much traffic that day, thankfully, so I quickly turned around at this little dirt access road about 150 yards ahead. My hands were actually shaking on the steering wheel. I kept telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or maybe even a bear cub, though I couldn't convince myself a bear cub would stand like that. As I drove back and rounded the bend again, I slowed way down, scanning the roadside. And there it was, standing right at the edge of the road, almost like it was waiting for me to come back. I stopped the car completely, about 30 feet away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was definitely not a bear, not a raccoon, not anything I recognized. The creature was facing the road now, looking right at my car. It was short, like I said, maybe 3 feet tall, but had proportions that were weirdly human-like, except for the head, which seemed too large for its body. Its entire body was covered in thick, golden brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but all over. The color was this rich amber shade, darker than a golden retriever, but with a similar sheen when the sunlight hit it. Its face, though, that's what really got to me. The face had much less hair, with patches of smooth, light-colored skin showing through, and the eyes, God, the eyes were big and dark, like deep brown pools with no visible whites. They didn't look animal at all. They looked aware, intelligent, and they were fixed right on me. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I wasn't scared exactly, more like completely dumbfounded. The thing had arms that hung down at its sides, with hands that looked almost human, but with longer fingers. Its legs were short and muscular, and its feet seemed human-like too, though I couldn't see them clearly from where I was. What really struck me was that it had virtually no neck. The head just sat low on its shoulders, giving it this compact appearance. I know how crazy this all sounds, but I'm telling you exactly what I saw, as clearly as I can remember it. For maybe 5 or 6 seconds we just stayed like that, me in my car, frozen, and this creature standing motionless at the roadside. Then, without warning, it moved, and the way it moved is something I'll never forget. It didn't turn and run like a bear or deer would. Instead, it ducked low, almost crouching, and then sprinted into the woods on 2 legs. Its arms pumped back and forth just like a human runner's would. The speed was incredible. It covered ground faster than any person could, especially through that thick underbrush. It headed straight for this marshy area with lots of dense bushes and small trees. Within seconds, it had disappeared completely. I sat there in my idling car for maybe a minute, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding in my ears. I finally pulled over to the side of the road, put on my hazards and got out. I don't know what I was thinking, that I'd go chase after it. But I felt compelled to at least look at where it had been standing. The shoulder of the road was mostly gravel, with some weeds growing through. I couldn't see any clear footprints, but there was a small area where the weeds were pressed down, like something had been standing there. The path into the woods was obvious, broken twigs and disturbed vegetation leading toward the swampy area. I stood at the edge of the woods, peering in. The marsh was maybe 50 yards in, with lots of skunk, cabbage and cattails, perfect hiding place. I called out, I don't even know why, just a, "Hello?" That felt ridiculous as soon as it left my mouth. Nothing responded, of course. I waited there for almost half an hour, watching the marsh, hoping the creature might reappear. It never did. Eventually another car came by, slowed down to see if I needed help, and I felt suddenly self-conscious standing there staring into the woods. I waved them on, got back in my car and left. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. What the hell had I seen? It wasn't a known animal, that's for sure. It moved with purpose, with intelligence. The way it ran, low to the ground but definitely upright, was unlike anything I've ever seen. And those eyes, they seemed to be studying me as much as I was studying it. When I got home, I immediately started researching. I looked up everything from escaped monkeys to bears with mange to known cryptids. Nothing quite matched. The closest things I found were reports of Littlefoot or juvenile Sasquatch creatures. But even those didn't quite fit what I'd seen. The hair color was wrong, and most Bigfoot reports describe much larger creatures. I went back to that same spot a couple weeks later, in early July. I parked at the same place and explored the marsh area thoroughly. I found nothing. No hair samples, no footprints. Nothing that would indicate anything unusual lived there. Just a typical Pennsylvania swampy area with the usual wildlife signs. Deer tracks, raccoon prints, bird nests. The thing that bothers me most, even now, is how it moved when it ran away. It didn't panic or flee randomly. It seemed to know exactly where to go for cover. It moved with intention, with familiarity of the terrain, like it belonged there, like it knew those woods better than any human could. I keep replaying that moment in my head, those few seconds when we locked eyes. There was recognition there, not like it knew me personally, but like it recognized what I was, a human, and it knew immediately that it needed to hide from me. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, and she believes I saw something unusual, though she's more inclined to think it was some kind of escaped exotic pet. A couple close friends know too, but they mostly just joke about me finding Bigfoot's baby. But I know what I saw wasn't a joke. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a known animal. For those brief moments on Route 192, I encountered something that shouldn't exist, according to our understanding of the natural world. I've gone back to that spot several times since then, different times of day, different weather conditions. I've never seen the creature again. Sometimes I wonder if it was just passing through, or if it lives deeper in the forest and rarely comes near the road, or maybe it saw me and now knows to avoid that area entirely. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a bear cub with some kind of deformity or disease that made it look different. Maybe it was some kind of large primate that escaped from someone keeping exotic pets. But then I remember those eyes, that deliberate movement, and I know better. Whatever I saw that day in June wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't part of the Pennsylvania wildlife I've known all my life. It was something else, something unexplained. I've mostly stopped actively looking for it now. But every time I drive that stretch of Route 192, I slow down at that curve. I scan the roadside and the edge of the marsh, just in case. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it, if there are others out there with similar stories who've kept quiet for fear of being ridiculed. I wonder how many unusual things are out there in those woods that we miss simply because we're not paying attention, or because we're too quick to dismiss what doesn't fit our understanding of the world. All I know for sure is what I saw that day. A small humanoid creature with golden brown hair, dark intelligent eyes, and movements that still haunt my dreams. And I know those Pennsylvania woods will never look quite the same to me again. Story 5. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened last spring, I've been coon hunting all my life, grew up doing it with my daddy in the backwoods of Louisiana, and I've spent more nights out in those woods than I can count. Nothing ever really scared me out there, until now. This all happened in early spring of 2014. I was out near Kisatchie National Forest, a spot I'd hunted hundreds of times before. My hound Blue is the best tracking dog I've ever owned. Never lost a trail, never got spooked by nothing. That dog's got more courage than most men I know. It was a cool evening, maybe around 7 o'clock when we headed out. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows through the pines. I remember it was unusually quiet that night. No cicadas yet. Birds all seemed to have turned in early, just me and Blue and the sound of our footsteps on the forest floor. We got to my usual starting point, and I let Blue off his lead. He took off like he always does, nose to the ground, tail wagging. I followed behind at my own pace, shotgun over my shoulder, just enjoying the peace and quiet. The usual routine, you know. Blue started barking, that excited bark that tells me he's caught a scent. I smiled to myself and kept walking, following the sound of his voice through the trees. Then something happened that had never happened before. Blue's barking just stopped, mid-bark, like someone had flipped a switch. I froze in my tracks, listening. Nothing. No sound at all. My heart started racing. Blue never stops barking once he's on a trail. Never. I called out for him, my voice sounding strange and small in the sudden silence. "Blue, come on, boy." No response. I started moving faster, pushing through the underbrush in the direction I'd last heard him. My mind was racing with all the possibilities. Maybe he'd been bitten by a snake or gotten caught in a trap. Maybe he'd run into a black bear. I was about 5 minutes into my search when I heard movement ahead of me. Blue emerged from the thick brush, and I felt a flood of relief. But it was short-lived. Something was wrong. His tail was tucked tight between his legs, his ears were flat against his head, and he was moving fast. Not running exactly, but moving with purpose, his eyes wide with what I can only describe as pure fear. When he reached me, he pressed himself against my legs, whimpering. I've never seen him like that. This dog has faced down angry raccoons, snakes, even stood his ground against a young black bear once. But something out there had terrified him completely. I tried to get him to go back, to show me what had scared him, but he wouldn't budge. He kept looking back over his shoulder into the darkening woods, whining low in his throat. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Seeing Blue like that scared me too. We headed back to the truck early that night, Blue sticking so close to my heels he nearly tripped me a couple times. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about what could have scared Blue so badly. I've been hunting those woods for 20 years, and I thought I knew every creature that lived there. By morning, curiosity had gotten the better of me. I decided to go back the next evening. I didn't take Blue this time. He got agitated as soon as I grabbed my gear, which wasn't like him at all. He usually goes crazy with excitement when we're about to hunt. But this time, he slunk off to hide under the porch. I almost changed my mind then, but I had to know what was out there. I drove down to the same area just before dusk. The narrow dirt road winds through about a mile of fields before it reaches the denser woods where we'd been hunting the night before. I was about halfway down this road, right where it passes a creek that feeds into the larger bayou, when my headlights swept across something that made me slam on the brakes. There, about 50 yards ahead of me, crossing from one side of the field toward the creek, was the biggest, I don't even know what to call it, a figure, walking upright on 2 legs. My first thought was bear, but I've seen plenty of bears stand up, and this wasn't that. This thing was walking naturally on 2 legs, with a smooth gait, nothing like a bear's awkward upright waddle. It was massive. I'd guess 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair, thick all over its body. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Shoulders too wide, arms too long. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the fading light, but I could see its head turn toward me when my headlights hit it. For a moment, just a moment, we looked at each other. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. There was intelligence in the way it looked at me, an awareness that went beyond animal instinct. Then it turned and continued into the tree line by the creek, moving with surprising grace for something so large. I sat there in my truck, engine idling, for maybe 5 minutes before I could make myself move again. I thought about following it, but something told me that would be a bad idea. Real bad. I turned around and headed home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way. When I got back, Blue was still under the porch. Wouldn't come out even when I called him. Smart dog. I spent that night looking up animal sightings in the area, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Nothing fit. I've hunted everything from raccoons to wild boar. I know what's supposed to be in those woods. This wasn't anything I recognized. The next day, I did something that probably seems crazy. I went back. I know, but I had to. This time I took Blue, figured if whatever it was came around again, he'd warn me. He didn't want to go, but he's loyal to a fault. Poor dog was trembling in the passenger seat the whole drive. I parked in a different spot this time, about a quarter-mile down the highway from where I'd seen the creature the night before. It was earlier, still a couple hours before sunset. I thought maybe I'd hike around, look for tracks, see if I could figure out what I was dealing with. Blue wouldn't get out of the truck. That's never happened before. He just lay down on the seat and refused to move, his eyes fixed on the woods beyond. I left him there and walked a little way into the tree line, just far enough that I could still see my truck. I wasn't stupid enough to go deep into the woods alone, not after what I'd seen. I found a fallen log to sit on and just waited, watching, listening. About an hour passed. The sun was getting low, painting everything gold and red. Then I heard it, a knocking sound from across the highway, deep in the woods. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct sounds, evenly spaced like someone hitting wood against wood. Then silence for maybe 30 seconds, then 3 more knocks. It wasn't a woodpecker or a branch falling. The rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. Something was making that sound on purpose. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The knocking continued for about 5 minutes, then stopped. I waited another hour, but heard nothing else unusual. As it got dark, I decided to head back to the truck. Blue was exactly where I'd left him, still trembling. I drove home slower than usual, scanning the edges of the road with my high beams. About halfway home, my lights caught something on the asphalt. I slowed down and got out to look, telling Blue to stay put. There, crossing the road from north to south, was a line of footprints. The road was still damp from rain earlier in the day, and whatever had crossed had left clear impressions. They were footprints, all right, but not human, and definitely not from any animal I know. They were huge, must have been 18 inches long at least. 5 toes, like a human foot, but wider with a different arch. I put my boot next to one for comparison. I wear a size 12, and it made my foot look like a child's. I took out my phone and snapped some pictures, but it was too dark, and they didn't come out clear. By morning I knew they'd be gone, either dried up or washed away if it rained again. Standing there in the dark, looking at those massive footprints, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been trying to deny. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know every animal that's supposed to be here, and I know what I saw wasn't any of them. I think I saw a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I'd have laughed them out of the room. But I know what I saw. I know what scared my dog so badly he wouldn't hunt. I know what made those knocking sounds in the woods, what left those massive footprints across the highway. I've ordered some game cameras. I'm going to set them up around that area, see if I can get some evidence. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, and a couple of hunting buddies. Most people would think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when I'm out in the woods now, I get this feeling, this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. Blue feels it too. He'll stop suddenly, the fur on his back standing up, and stare into the trees at something I can't see. I still hunt those woods. I've got 20 years of memories there, and I'm not about to be scared off. But I hunt differently now, more aware, more cautious, and I never ever hunt alone after dark in that part of the forest. Sometimes I think about that moment when our eyes met, me in my truck, and that thing at the edge of the field. There was something in that look. Not aggression, not fear, just awareness. Recognition maybe, like it was thinking about me as much as I was thinking about it. I've started keeping a journal of strange things I notice out there. Unusual sounds, broken branches too high up for a person to reach, places where blue refuses to go. I'm starting to see patterns, and I think I might be learning its habits, its territory. I don't know if I'll ever see it clearly again. Part of me hopes I do, so I can prove to myself and others that I'm not crazy. Another part of me hopes I don't, because what do you do after you've seen something like that? How does the world go back to normal? All I know is that my woods don't feel the same anymore. They feel occupied, like I'm the visitor now, not the other way around. And sometimes when I'm driving home late and my headlights sweep across that field by the creek, I slow down and look extra carefully at the tree line, wondering if it's out there, watching me the way I'm watching for it. Story 6. I still don't know what to make of what happened that night, even after all these years. It's taken me nearly 17 years to even type this out. I guess I'm hoping someone else has seen something similar and can help me make sense of it, because I'm still struggling to. It was early October of 2006. I was 22, hanging out with 4 of my friends, Jessica, Mike, Ryan, and Amber. We all grew up together in this small Alabama town where literally nothing ever happens. So on weekends, we'd drive around back roads, find places to hang out, drink a few beers, and just escape the boredom. That night started like any other. We piled into my old Chevy Blazer around 8 and decided to head north of Phil Campbell. There's all these abandoned places and old cemeteries out there, and we thought it would be cool to check them out with Halloween coming up. I remember it was a clear night, not too cold yet, but definitely that fall feeling in the air. We had been driving for maybe 45 minutes when we found this small cemetery at the top of a hill. It wasn't marked on any main road. You had to know it was there, or stumble on it by accident like we did. The cemetery itself was tiny, maybe 15 or 20 graves, most of them really old. It sat in this small clearing surrounded by woods, with a barbed wire fence separating it from this crazy steep slope that dropped down into a hollow. We parked near the cemetery around 9. I remember checking the time because Jessica was complaining she had to be home by midnight. We got out, cracked open some beers, and were just hanging out, talking about random stuff. Mike was telling some stupid ghost story he made up about the cemetery, trying to scare Amber, who was easily freaked out by that kind of thing. From where we were standing, we could see lights from a farm down in the hollow. There was a barn down there, and we could hear dogs barking. Not like normal barking, though. These dogs were going absolutely insane, like they were terrified or trying to warn about something. It was so loud, we actually stopped talking to listen. Then, out of nowhere, the barking just stopped, completely. Not like they gradually quieted down. It was like someone hit a mute button. The silence felt wrong somehow. That's when I noticed everything had gone quiet. No crickets, no frogs, no night sounds at all. I remember Ryan saying, "That's weird as hell," and Mike telling him to shut up so we could listen. That's when we heard it. Movement in the brush on the slope below us. Heavy movement like something big was making its way up. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or even a bear, though bears aren't common in that area. But whatever it was sounded way too heavy, and it was moving in a deliberate way, not like an animal just wandering around. We all kind of froze, staring toward the barbed wire fence and the slope beyond it. The sounds got closer and closer, branches breaking, leaves rustling, but in this steady rhythm that felt purposeful. I remember Amber grabbing my arm so tight it hurt. Then it reached the top of the slope, just on the other side of the fence. In the moonlight, I could see the brush moving. And then, Jesus, I still get chills thinking about it. This thing stood up. It just rose up from all fours to standing upright, and it was massive, absolutely massive. I'm 6 foot, and this thing was at least 7 feet tall, probably more. It had this broad, thick body, completely covered in dark brown hair or fur. Not like a costume, the hair moved naturally with its body. Its arms were proportionally too long for a human, hanging down past its knees. The moonlight wasn't super bright, but it was enough to see the outline and basic features. It just stood there, maybe 30 feet from us, staring. I couldn't make out facial details clearly, but I could feel it watching us. Nobody moved or said anything for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Amber was the first to react. She screamed and bolted for the car. That broke the spell for everyone except me. Mike, Ryan and Jessica all ran after her, piling into the back seats. I just stood there, completely frozen, staring at this thing that shouldn't exist. It wasn't moving toward us or making any sounds. It was just watching. I don't know what snapped me out of it, probably my friends yelling my name from the car. But suddenly I could move again. I backed up slowly at first, then turned and ran to the driver's side. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys, had to fumble around on the ground to find them. The whole time I could feel it watching me. I got in, jammed the keys into the ignition, and started the car. The headlights came on automatically, and for a split second, they illuminated the creature fully. That's when it raised its arms to cover its face, like the light hurt its eyes, or it didn't want to be seen clearly. Those hands, I'll never forget them. They were huge, with long fingers that looked almost human, but not quite. Too long, too thick. It quickly moved sideways behind some trees, but kept watching us from there. I could see its outline and the reflection of light in its eyes. I threw the car into reverse, spun around too fast, nearly hit a headstone, then got us the hell out of there. Nobody said a word for at least 10 minutes. We were all just breathing hard, processing what we'd seen. Jessica was crying quietly. Mike kept looking out the back window like he expected it to be following us. When we finally started talking, it was in this weird, hushed way, like we were afraid it might hear us, even though we were miles away by then. "What the fuck was that?" Ryan kept saying. "What the actual fuck was that?" None of us had an answer. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But we all knew those explanations were bullshit. Bears don't stand that tall or look that way, and who would be out in the middle of nowhere in a costume that realistic, just waiting for random people to show up? When we got back to town, we sat in the parking lot of the Waffle House for hours, just talking about what we'd seen. We all agreed on the basic details, how tall it was, the hair covering its body, those unnaturally long arms and big hands. But what struck me most, what still haunts me, was how easily it had climbed that slope. That hill was steep as hell, covered in thick brush and briar patches that would tear your skin up if you tried to go through them. But this thing moved up it like it was nothing. And the silence. The way everything went quiet before it appeared. The dogs stopping mid-bark. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. We made a pact that night not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? But we didn't need to discuss never going back there. That was understood. None of us has ever returned to that spot. I don't even like driving on that road anymore. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I kept seeing those eyes in the dark, those hands covering its face in the headlights. I'd jerk awake thinking I heard heavy footsteps outside my window. Eventually, the immediacy of it faded. But I've never forgotten or fully processed what I saw. Over the years, I've quietly researched similar sightings in Alabama. There have been a surprising number in the northern part of the state, especially in the more remote areas. People describing the same thing, tall, hairy, humanoid creatures that move with surprising speed and stealth for their size. Jessica moved to Tennessee a year later. She told me before she left that she still had nightmares about that night. Mike and Ryan stopped hanging out as much after that. It's like what we saw created this uncomfortable bond that none of us wanted to acknowledge. We'd see each other around town, and there'd be this unspoken thing between us. Amber is the only one I still talk to regularly, and even now, 16 years later, she refuses to go hiking or camping. Sometimes I wonder if we all collectively hallucinated it somehow, but I know we didn't. I know what I saw standing 30 feet away from me that night. I know what I heard climbing up that impossible slope. I know how the world went silent before it appeared. I've never told anyone else this story until now. I'm still not sure what to call what we saw. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species, the label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was real, it was there, and for a few terrifying minutes, it was looking right at us. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night on a dark road, I can't help but check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me, or those long arms reaching for the car. I still wonder if it remembers us as clearly as we remember it. Story 7. I've never really told this story to many people outside my family. When you're a kid and you see something like that, most adults just pat you on the head and tell you it was your imagination. But I know what I saw that day in '83, and it wasn't my bloody imagination. I was 10 years old, living with my family on our property east of Charters Towers in Queensland. For those not familiar with Australia, it's pretty isolated out there, about 35 kilometers from town, surrounded by bush and scrubland. Our place backed onto Kookaburra Creek, which in the dry season was mostly just a series of waterholes connected by a trickle, but in the wet could rise up and isolate us for days. That summer was particularly hot, even by North Queensland standards, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and your clothes stick to your skin minutes after you step outside. My parents ran cattle on the property, and I spent most days exploring with the neighbor kids when I wasn't helping with chores. There were 2 girls from the property next to ours, Jessie, who was about my age, and her older sister Megan, who was 12. Their family had lived there for generations, way longer than we had. We'd only moved to the property about 2 years earlier. From the first month we arrived, something felt off about certain parts of our land. You know that feeling when you're alone, but suddenly you're convinced someone's watching you, that crawling sensation on the back of your neck? We got that a lot, especially near the creek. My dad used to joke about drop bears watching us, but I could tell even he felt uneasy sometimes. The day it happened was a Tuesday in mid-January. School holidays were almost over, and we were making the most of our freedom. Jessie and Megan had come over in the morning, and we'd been helping my dad move some young cattle to a different paddock. They had this old horse, Dusty, who they'd ridden over. He was this massive chestnut gelding, so tall I needed a fence to climb up if I wanted to get on him. After lunch, it got too hot to do much of anything. My mum made us sandwiches and told us to stay in the shade. Of course, being kids, we decided the best shade was down by the creek where it was cooler. My dad was busy fixing fences with my uncle, and Mum was inside dealing with my baby sister who was teething, so nobody noticed us slipping away. The creek was about a 15-minute walk from our house. The path wound through scrubby bush, all eucalypts, wattles, and that yellow flowering shrub that smells like honey when it blooms. We were leading Dusty because it was too hot to ride him. Plus, we were planning to let him cool off in one of the deeper water holes. We weren't being particularly quiet. Megan was telling us about some movie she'd seen at a friend's place in town. Something about aliens, I think. And Jessie and I were arguing about whether we'd see any yabbies in the creek. Normal kid stuff. There's this bend in the creek near a big old gum tree that's half fallen over. The roots are exposed on one side where the bank has eroded away, creating this sort of natural bridge. We always crossed there because it was the easiest spot to get to the other side without getting your feet wet. As we came around that bend, I remember Dusty suddenly stopping. His ears went forward, and he made this snorting sound that horses make when they're nervous. I thought maybe he'd seen a snake or something, so I was scanning the ground, not looking ahead. Then I heard it, this deep, throaty sound, not quite a growl, but something primal, something that made every hair on my body stand up. I looked up, and there it was, just 5 or 10 meters away on the opposite bank. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was kneeling by the water's edge, with one knee up and one down, hunched over like it was drinking or maybe looking at something in the water. Its back was mostly to us, but it was turned just enough that I could see its profile. The thing was massive, covered in thick, dark hair, almost black, but with a brownish tint where the sun hit it. The hair on its arms seemed a bit lighter, more of a dirty brown. Its shoulders were so broad, they reminded me of my uncle, who was a professional rugby player, just enormous, muscular. But this thing made my uncle look small. Its head was huge and seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders, no neck that I could see. The head had this domed shape to it, and though I couldn't see its face properly through the scrub, I remember thinking it looked wrong, not like any animal I knew. When I try to estimate how tall it was, I always think about my dad, who was 6'1". This thing, if it had stood up, would have towered over him, 7 feet at least, maybe more. For what felt like forever, but was probably just a couple of seconds, none of us moved. Not us, not Dusty, not the thing. Then it turned its head slightly toward us and made that sound again, that deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I remember my legs feeling like they'd turned to concrete. My mouth went completely dry, and I couldn't even scream. Dusty reared up, yanking the reins out of Megan's hands. That seemed to break the spell. "Run!" I finally managed to shout, already backing away. But what happened next was almost as scary as the creature itself. Jessie tugged at my arm and said, in this completely casual voice, like she was commenting on the weather, "It's one of those things that hangs around here sometimes. Come on, let's go." Megan was already chasing after Dusty, who'd bolted back the way we came. I remember looking at Jessie's face, expecting to see terror, but she just looked annoyed, like we'd encountered a dangerous bull or something ordinary, not like we'd just seen some kind of monster. I stumbled backwards, unable to take my eyes off the thing by the creek. It hadn't moved to chase us, but it was watching us now, its massive body still hunched in that kneeling position. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran was it slowly rising, unfolding itself to its full height. We ran all the way back to the house, panting and sweating in the afternoon heat. Dusty had already made it back and was standing nervously by the fence, still saddled, but with the reins dragging on the ground. My mum came out onto the veranda when she heard us, asking what all the commotion was about. I was trying to explain between gasps for breath, but Jessie cut me off. "Dusty got spooked by a wild pig," she said, giving me a look I couldn't interpret. "Down by the creek." Megan nodded in agreement. "Yeah, big boar. Made Dusty bolt." I stood there with my mouth hanging open. Why were they lying? What we saw was no pig. But before I could say anything, Jessie grabbed my wrist and squeezed it hard, shaking her head slightly. Later, when my mum went back inside, I confronted them. "Why did you lie? That wasn't a pig. What was that thing?" Jessie looked at Megan, who shrugged and said, "Look, Russell, just don't talk about it, all right? Especially not to adults." "But what was it?" I insisted. "Dunno what they're called," Jessie said quietly. "They've always been here. Our granddad used to see them too. They don't usually bother people if you leave them alone." "They?" I remember my voice cracking. "There's more than one." "Course there is," Megan said like I was stupid. "They live in the hills past the creek. Sometimes they come down for water in the dry season." I couldn't believe how casual they were being, but it was huge, and that sound it made. "Yeah, they do that when they're annoyed," Jessie said. "Dad says never to look them in the eye or they get angry." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside my window, branches scraping, leaves rustling. Normally those sounds wouldn't bother me, but all I could think about was that massive shape unfolding itself by the creek, standing to its full height. The next morning, I begged my dad to come with me to the creek. I told him I wanted to show him where we saw a really big animal. He was busy, but eventually agreed to come after lunch. Of course, by the time we got there, whatever it was had long gone, but there was evidence something had been there. The mud by the water's edge was disturbed, and there were indentations that looked like knee prints, massive ones. And on the trunk of a nearby tree, about 7 feet up, there were scratch marks in the bark. My dad frowned at those marks. "Probably just a big roo," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Kangaroos don't leave marks that high up, and they don't have claws that would make gouges like that. I almost told him then, but I remembered the warning looks from Jesse and Megan. Something in their expressions had scared me almost as much as the creature itself, like they knew something terrible would happen if people started talking about these things. Over the next few weeks, I noticed my dad putting extra locks on our doors and boarding up a broken window on the shed that had been that way since we moved in. He never said anything, but he started carrying his rifle when he went to check the far paddocks near the creek. The girls never mentioned it again. When I tried to bring it up once, Jesse just said, "Some things you just live with, Russell, like snakes and spiders. You respect them, stay away from them, and everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. I started having nightmares about massive hairy arms reaching through my window. I'd wake up sweating, convinced I could hear that deep, rumbling growl outside. We moved away from that property the following year. Dad said it was because he got a better job offer closer to town, but I always wondered if there was more to it. The night before we left, I overheard him talking to Mum about how the cattle on the far side of the creek kept going missing, and how he'd found tracks that didn't make any sense. It's been 40 years now, and I've never seen anything like that creature again. I've read stories about yowies, Australia's version of Bigfoot, and I suppose that's what it must have been. But none of the descriptions quite match what I saw that day. Sometimes I think about contacting Jesse and Megan to ask them about it, but I never have. Some part of me is still afraid, not just of the creature, but of knowing the truth. Because if what they said was right, if these things have always been there, then what else don't we know about the bush? What else is watching us when we feel those eyes on the back of our neck? All I know for certain is what I saw that hot January day by Kookaburra Creek. And sometimes, when I'm camping and I hear rustling in the bush at night, I remember that massive shape unfolding itself, rising to its full height, and I lie very still, hoping it doesn't remember me. Story 8. I'm still struggling to make sense of what happened to us that night in early November 2016. It's been nearly 7 years, but I can still feel that cold air on my face and hear those sounds in the woods. We were raccoon hunting near Howley, Massachusetts, something I've done countless times since I was a teenager. There were 8 of us that night. Me, my brother Jake, my cousin Rob, and 5 guys we've hunted with for years. Nothing special about that evening when we started out. Weather was typical for early November in New England, cold enough to see your breath, but not freezing yet. We'd planned this trip for weeks. We got to our usual spot around sunset. The plan was simple, like always. Release the dogs to track the raccoons, follow them in the pickup as far as we could on the dirt roads, then go on foot when the trails got too narrow. My dog Rusty was the first one out of the truck, followed by Jake's 2 hounds and the others. Those dogs live for this. They were howling and circling, noses to the ground, tails wagging like crazy. We let them pick up the scent and start tracking while we followed in my F-150, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. About 40 minutes in, the dirt road narrowed to the point where even my truck couldn't squeeze through. Normally we'd grab our gear and follow on foot, but something felt off that night. The woods were too quiet, no owls, no rustling, nothing but our dogs barking in the distance. "Let's call the dogs back," I said. "We can try another spot." Mike, who was riding shotgun, blew the whistle we used to call them. Usually takes a few minutes for all the dogs to come back, especially when they're on a scent. But that night, they came running back almost immediately. and not in the normal excited way. They were terrified. Rusty has been hunting with me for 6 years, and I've never seen him like that. He jumped into the truck bed with his tail tucked between his legs, whining and shaking. The other dogs were the same, wide-eyed, panting, desperate to get in the truck. One of them was so scared he pissed himself right there in the bed of my truck. "What the hell spooked them?" Jake asked, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Bear, probably," Rob suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Bears don't usually scare experienced hunting dogs that badly. We decided to head back. I turned the truck around on that narrow path, which wasn't easy, and started driving slowly back the way we came. The dogs were still whimpering in the back, which kept us all on edge. We'd gone maybe half a mile when I suddenly slammed on the brakes. My heart nearly stopped. About 40 yards ahead of us, between 2 large oak trees that lined the dirt road, stood something. I can't call it a man, and it wasn't exactly an animal either. It was massive, so broad it literally filled the gap between those trees, which had to be at least 4 feet apart. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered beside me. "What is that?" In the dim headlights and shadows, it was hard to make out details, but the figure was dark brown or black, standing completely upright. It had to be at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller. It wasn't moving, just watching us. The stillness was what got me. It wasn't startled by our headlights or the sound of the engine. It was just observing. The dogs went absolutely berserk, barking and howling like I've never heard before, pure terror. I felt the hair on my arms stand up, and my mouth went completely dry. "Back up," Jake said from the back seat, his voice shaking. "Back up now." I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the truck into reverse and backed up about 50 feet, keeping my eyes on that figure the whole time. It didn't move, didn't run, didn't do anything. "Bear?" Rob suggested again, but his voice cracked. "No way," Mike responded. "Bears don't stand like that." "Could be a guy in a suit," someone else offered, but none of us believed it. Who would be out here, alone in the woods at night, wearing what looked like a gorilla costume? "Let's go back and see," I said after a minute, curiosity temporarily overcoming my fear. "Are you insane?" Jake hissed, but I was already putting the truck in drive. I inched forward slowly, headlights trained on the spot where we'd seen the figure. It was gone, completely vanished without a sound, which seemed impossible given its size and the dry leaves covering the ground. When we reached the spot where it had been standing, I stopped the truck and we all sat there in silence for a moment. The dogs had quieted down, but were still whimpering. "Shine the light over there," I told Mike, pointing to the side of the road. What we saw next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. On either side of the dirt road were 2 shallow pools of water from the rain earlier that week, and right between them, in the soft mud, was a footprint. Not a boot print or a bare paw. A foot, a giant human-like foot, pressed so deep into the mud you could tell whatever made it was incredibly heavy. "Holy shit," Rob whispered as we all climbed out to look. The print was easily 16 inches long, with 5 clearly visible toes. The impression was at least 2 inches deep in the mud. None of us could make a print that deep even jumping on it with all our weight. Mike, who wears a size 13 boot, put his foot next to it for comparison. The print dwarfed his boot, both in length and width. "That's not human," he said, stating the obvious. His hand was shaking as he held the flashlight. While we were examining the print, we heard branches snapping in the woods to our right. Loud cracks that couldn't be made by anything small. The dogs went crazy again, and we all scrambled back to the truck. I floored it out of there, not caring about the rough road. About a quarter-mile later, I hit a rock so hard it blew out my right front tire. We had to stop and change it, and the whole time we were working, everyone kept looking over their shoulders, expecting to see that massive figure emerging from the trees. The flat tire took us 15 minutes to change, with all of us working together in tense silence. Once we got moving again, Rob suggested we go back to check the footprint again. "Are you out of your mind?" Jake asked. "We need evidence," Rob insisted. "No one's going to believe us otherwise." Against my better judgment, I agreed, and we drove back to the spot. But our hasty retreat had splashed mud and water all over the area, and the truck wheels had partially run over the print. Only a faint edge of it was still visible in the mud. "Take a picture anyway," I told Rob, who snapped a few with his phone. The photos didn't show much, just disturbed mud that could have been anything. We got out of there as fast as we could and didn't speak much on the drive back to town. What could we say? We all saw it, but none of us wanted to be the first to name what we thought it was. Later that night, over beers at my place, Terry, one of the older guys in our group, finally said what we were all thinking. That was a Sasquatch, a goddamn Bigfoot. Instead of laughing like I might have before that night, we all just nodded silently. Terry then told us about something he'd seen the previous year near a pond outside Savoy. He'd been driving home around dusk when he spotted what he thought was a person standing by the water, but as he slowed down, he realized it was grey-colored and much too large. The creature turned its body slowly, but kept its head facing Terry's car the entire time, then walked into the woods. "I never told anyone," he admitted. "Who would believe me?" We all would now. It's been 7 years since that night, and I've been back to those woods many times since then, always during daylight, always with at least 2 other people. I've never seen anything like that again, but I don't hunt at night anymore. None of us do. The dogs changed after that night too. Rusty, who used to live for hunting, now refuses to go more than a few yards into the woods. He'll stand at the edge of the tree line, hackles raised, and no amount of coaxing will get him to go further. I've read every book and article I could find about Bigfoot sightings. Most sound like hoaxes or misidentifications, but some, the ones with footprints, the ones where people describe that feeling of being watched by something intelligent, those ring true to me now. I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a costume, and it wasn't a trick of the light. It was something that shouldn't exist according to science, but does. Something that's managed to stay hidden in the woods, watching us while we think we're alone. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about how it just stood there, watching us. Not running, not afraid, just observing, like we were the curiosity, not it. And I wonder if right now, somewhere in those Massachusetts woods, it's watching someone else who has no idea what's standing in the shadows. I don't expect everyone to believe this. Hell, I wouldn't have believed it myself before that night. But I know what all 8 of us saw, and I know what made that footprint. It wasn't anything from this world as we understand it, but it's out there all the same. The woods don't feel empty to me anymore. Story 9. I still get this sick feeling in my stomach when I think about that day in Denard back in 2005. I was 13, and it was supposed to be just another summer Saturday like any other. Me, Kyle, and Matt had been planning our fishing trip to East Fork Creek for almost a week. Kyle's parents had this place out near the woods, and they were cool with us going fishing as long as we were back before dark. We got up early that morning, like 6 a.m. early. Kyle's mum made us sandwiches and packed some sodas in our backpacks. We grabbed our fishing poles, tackle boxes, and headed out. The walk to East Fork Creek wasn't easy. We had to go through some pretty dense forest and down these steep hills. It took us almost an hour and a half to get there, but we didn't care. We were 13, full of energy, and the idea of spending a day fishing without adults breathing down our necks was worth any hike. The fishing spot was perfect. The creek was running clear after some rain earlier that week, and we caught a bunch of smallmouth bass. Matt even hooked this catfish that had to be at least 5 pounds. We spent hours just hanging out, eating our sandwiches, talking about school and girls and video games, normal kid stuff. It was one of those perfect summer days where nothing can go wrong, until it did. We started heading back around 4 in the afternoon. The climb back was always harder than going down, so we knew we needed plenty of time to make it back before sunset. The first part of the hike was fine. We were tired but in good spirits, laughing about Matt falling in the creek when he tried to net his catfish. I think we were about halfway up the big hill when things started feeling different. At first, it was just this weird sense that something was off. The forest had been noisy all day. Birds, squirrels, wind in the trees. But suddenly it got quiet. Not completely silent, but that natural background noise just dropped away. I remember looking at Kyle, and he was glancing around too, so I knew he felt it. "You guys hear that?" Matt whispered. We stopped walking. "Hear what?" I asked. But then I did hear it. Something moving in the brush to our left. Not continuous walking, more like something taking a step, pausing, then taking another step, following alongside us but staying just out of sight. "Probably just a deer," Kyle said, but he didn't sound convinced. We picked up our pace a little. The feeling of being watched was intense, like when you know someone's staring at you in class, but 100 times stronger. The back of my neck was tingling, and I kept fighting the urge to run. Whatever was moving parallel to us in the woods kept pace, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. After another 15 minutes of climbing, we stopped at this little spring that fed into a small branch. We were all sweating and needed water. As we knelt by the spring, filling our water bottles, the forest went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just our breathing and the soft gurgle of the spring. That's when we heard it. Heavy movement on the old logging road about 300 feet above us on the hillside. At first it sounded like something big walking, really big. Then there was a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across rock. "What the hell is that?" Matt whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard a loud crack, then a rumbling noise. I looked up just in time to see a boulder. And I'm not talking about some little rock. This thing was massive, like washing machine sized, tumbling down the hillside toward us. "Move!" Kyle screamed, and we all scrambled away from the spring. The boulder crashed through the underbrush, snapping small trees, and slammed into the ground right where we'd been standing moments before. The impact was so hard, I felt it through my feet. We barely had time to process what happened when we heard that scraping sound again. Then another boulder came crashing down, then another and another. These weren't small rocks that might have been dislodged by an animal. These were huge, deliberate, and they were being aimed right at us. After the 5th or 6th boulder thundered past us, there was a pause. The three of us were frozen, pressed against trees, terrified to move. That's when I looked up the slope. I still remember it so clearly it makes my hands shake typing this. Standing near the top of the ridge was something. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its body was wide, especially through the chest, and completely covered in black hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair. It had one arm braced against a tree trunk, leaning forward slightly, like it was watching to see if its boulders had hit their target. I only saw it for maybe 2 seconds before it stepped back behind the ridge. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but the shape and size were unmistakable, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that this thing had deliberately thrown those massive rocks at us. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely working. Kyle and Matt both nodded, their faces pale. We didn't need to discuss what to do next. As if by silent agreement, we all turned and started running, not straight up the hill where that thing was waiting, but angling to the right, trying to find another way up. The fear was like nothing I've ever experienced. It wasn't just being scared of getting hurt. It was deeper, more primal, like my body recognized something that my brain couldn't fully process. I remember my legs felt both heavy and somehow disconnected, like they weren't fully under my control. My chest burned, not just from exertion, but from pure terror. We scrambled up the hillside, grabbing onto tree trunks and roots to pull ourselves up the steeper sections. None of us spoke. The only sounds were our ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves and twigs under our feet. About halfway up the new route, I made the mistake of looking back. It was standing on a rocky outcrop about 100 yards away, perfectly outlined against the sky, tall and massive, with one hand resting on a tree, just watching us. Even from that distance, I could feel its eyes on me. I nearly tripped when I saw it. and Kyle grabbed my arm to steady me. "Don't look back," he hissed. "Just keep moving." We didn't stop running until we reached Kyle's house. His parents were in the backyard grilling burgers, and they looked surprised to see us burst from the tree line, sweaty and wide-eyed. "You boys okay?" Kyle's dad asked, flipping a burger. "Look like you've seen a ghost." We mumbled something about being chased by a dog. We didn't even discuss it. We all just instinctively knew that telling adults would be pointless. They'd say it was a bear, or our imagination, or that we were making it up for attention, but we knew what we saw. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing on the ridge, hurling boulders down at us with impossible strength. When I did sleep, I had nightmares about being chased through endless woods. We didn't talk much about it after that, not even among ourselves. It was like we were afraid that putting it into words would make it more real, or maybe less real, like talking about it might somehow transform this terrifying experience into just another campfire story that no one really believes. For the rest of that summer, none of us suggested going back to East Fork Creek. We found other places to fish, always closer to houses, always in more open areas, and we never went into those woods alone. Years later, when we were in high school, Matt brought it up once when the three of us were driving back from a football game. "You guys ever think about that thing we saw in the woods that time?" he asked quietly. There was a long silence before Kyle said, "Yeah, I think about it a lot." "It was at least 8 feet tall," I said. "Maybe taller." "And those arms," Matt added, "they hung down past its knees." "No neck," Kyle said, "just this round head set right on those shoulders." We all agreed on what we'd seen. A creature with a wide chest, completely covered in black hair, with incredible strength. Not a human in a suit, not a bear, not shadows playing tricks on our eyes. Something else. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years. I've watched documentaries and scrolled through forums where people share their encounters. Some of those stories sound just like ours. The feeling of being watched, the unnatural silence in the woods, the thrown rocks or wood knocks. I know a lot of people don't believe, and I get it. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it was territorial behavior, if we had unknowingly entered its space, and it was warning us to leave. The precision of those boulders is what still haunts me. They came close enough to terrify us, but didn't actually hit us. Like it was sending a message. I'm 29 now, and I've hiked and camped all over the country since then, but I've never gone back to those woods outside Denard. And whenever I'm in the forest, and that feeling of being watched creeps up my spine, I don't stick around to see if history will repeat itself. Some messages only need to be delivered once. Story 10. I've never really told this story to many people. Most folks just laugh it off or think I'm making it up. But I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to share actually happened to me when I was 10 years old. I grew up on a dairy farm in northern New South Wales, right near the border ranges. Our property backed onto this dense subtropical rainforest that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of place where the trees grew so thick that even on the brightest day, it was dim and cool beneath the canopy. My dad used to say that land hadn't changed much in thousands of years. It was autumn, I remember, because the mornings had that crisp feel, but the days were still warm. I'd just turned 10 a few months before, and I was trusted to bring in the cows for the afternoon milking. It wasn't a big deal. I'd done it hundreds of times. Our dog Bluey always came with me. He was this blue heeler that had been with us since before I was born, smart as a whip and twice as loyal. That day started like any other. I finished my schoolwork around 3 o'clock. I was homeschooled back then. Had a quick snack and headed out to round up the cows. They usually grazed in the back paddock, which butted right up against the forest edge. There was a creek that ran through there, and the grass was always lush. As I crested the hill, I could see the herd down near the tree line. But something was off. They weren't scattered about grazing like normal. Instead, they were all bunched together, facing the forest. Even from a distance, I could tell they were agitated, tails swishing, heads bobbing, shifting their weight back and forth. I whistled for Bluey to circle around, but he wasn't obeying commands like usual. He'd gone rigid beside me, his ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbling in his chest. The hair along his spine was standing straight up. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, suddenly feeling uneasy myself. That's when I noticed movement in the trees, just a dark shape shifting between the trunks about 30 meters into the forest. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or maybe one of the Aboriginal fellas who sometimes hunted on the edge of our property. My dad was fine with it, said they'd been hunting there long before we came along. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone there?" No response, just the rustle of leaves and the increasingly nervous lowing of the cows. I told myself not to be scared. I was the farmer's son, after all. Dad would expect me to handle things. So I started walking toward the cows, hoping they'd turn and head toward the milking shed like they normally would. But they didn't move, and Bluey, loyal, fearless Bluey, wouldn't go past me toward the forest. He stayed glued to my leg, still growling. That's when I saw it more clearly. Whatever was in the trees had moved, stepping into a small clearing about 20 meters from the forest edge. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. It was tall, taller than my dad, who was 6 foot, broad shoulders with arms that seemed too long, hanging down past where its knees should be. The whole body was covered in this dark reddish-brown hair or fur, not shaggy like a dog's, but not sleek either, something in between. The thing that really got me was how it stood, perfectly upright on 2 legs, the way no animal I'd ever seen could stand. Its head was large and somewhat pointed at the top, almost conical. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was partly shadowed by the canopy, but I could see a heavy brow ridge and what looked like a wide, flat nose. It didn't make any sound. It just stood there, utterly still, except for a slight turn of its head, like it was listening. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me frozen in the paddock, Bluey growling, the cows bunched together, and this creature watching us from the edge of the trees. It could have been seconds or minutes. Time seemed to stop. Then, without any hurry, it stepped backward into the bush, not turning around, just moving backward while still facing us. Within moments, it had vanished among the trees. The spell broke. I started shaking so badly my knees almost gave out. I whistled for Bluey, who didn't need any encouragement to help me get the cows moving away from the forest edge. They were more than willing to go, practically stampeding toward the milking shed. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. I had this feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. Bluey stayed close, constantly checking the tree line, his hackles still raised. When we got back to the shed, Dad was already setting up for milking. He took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I blurted out everything, the cow's behavior, Bluey's growling, and the tall, hairy creature I'd seen. I was talking fast, words tumbling over each other, expecting Dad to grab his rifle and call the neighbors or something, but he didn't. He just nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "Probably just a big roo standing up," he said finally. "They can look mighty strange in the shadows." "Dad, it wasn't a kangaroo," I insisted. "It was walking on 2 legs. It was tall as you, maybe taller." He put his hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes our eyes play tricks on us, Tommy, especially in the bush when the light's filtering through the trees." I couldn't believe he was dismissing it so easily. I turned to Mum when she came out to help with the milking, but she just exchanged a look with Dad that I couldn't interpret. "Stay away from the bush in the evenings," she told me, "and always take Bluey with you when you're out on the property." That was it. No panic, no investigation, no calling the police, just a warning to be careful and a suggestion that I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen, but I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what Bluey and the cows had sensed. Animals don't lie. They don't have imaginations that run wild or eyes that play tricks on them. The The next few weeks, I was jumpy as hell. I did my chores, brought in the cows, but I was always watching the tree line. I started carrying a stick with me. Not that it would have done much good, but it made me feel a little braver. About a week after the sighting, I found something that confirmed what I'd seen wasn't my imagination. Near the creek, where it crossed into our property from the forest, there were these impressions in the mud, footprints, but not like any I'd seen before. They were huge, almost twice the size of my dad's boots, and shaped like a bare human foot, but broader across the toes. The stride length between them was massive, longer than I could stretch my legs. I ran to get Dad, but by the time I dragged him out there, a light rain had started, and the prints were already losing their shape, becoming just muddy depressions. He said they were probably from cattle crossing at an odd angle, or maybe wild pigs rooting around. But I knew better. Those were the footprints of whatever I'd seen. Over the next couple of months, I noticed other signs too. Branches broken high up in trees along the forest edge, way higher than any person could reach without a ladder. Strange, twisted patterns in the tall grass, like something large had bedded down. Once, I even found what looked like hair caught on a barbed wire fence. Coarse, reddish-brown strands that weren't from any of our livestock. I collected that hair in a matchbox and kept it under my bed. Sometimes I'd take it out and look at it just to remind myself I wasn't crazy. The weird thing is, after a while, life just went back to normal. The cows stopped acting skittish near the forest. Bluey relaxed, and although I never stopped being vigilant, I never saw the creature again. It wasn't until years later, when I was about 16, that I heard the Aboriginal stories about the yowie, a large, hairy hominid that supposedly lived in the remote bushlands of Australia. The descriptions matched what I'd seen perfectly. Some said it was just a legend, Australia's version of Bigfoot or the Yeti. Others, particularly some of the older Aboriginal people, spoke of it as a real creature, something that had always been there in the deep bush. That's when another memory surfaced, something I'd forgotten. About a month after my sighting, I overheard my parents talking late at night when they thought I was asleep. Dad was telling Mum about how his own father had seen one of those things back in the 50s, in almost the exact same spot on our property. No point in scaring the boy, he'd said. Nothing good comes from talking about it. Some things are best left alone. So they had believed me. They just didn't want to acknowledge it. I'm 35 now, living in the city with a family of my own. I haven't been back to the farm since my parents sold it after I went to university. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners have seen anything, if that creature or others like it still move through those trees. I've never told this story publicly before. Most people don't believe in things they haven't seen themselves, and I got tired of the skeptical looks and the barely concealed amusement. But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a kangaroo, it wasn't a man in a suit, it wasn't my imagination. It was something ancient, something that belonged to that forest in a way that we humans, with our cleared fields and fences, never will. I don't know if it meant any harm. It certainly had the opportunity to hurt me if it wanted to. Maybe it was just curious, checking out the small human who'd wandered near its territory. All I know is that I'm not the only one who's seen such a thing, and I probably won't be the last. There are still wild places in this world, still mysteries in the bush. And sometimes, if you're lucky, or unlucky enough, those mysteries reveal themselves just for a moment before disappearing back into the shadows. Story 11. I've never told this story to many people. Honestly, I don't blame those who think I'm making it up or just remembering some childhood nightmare. But what happened to me in fall of '96 still gives me cold sweats 27 years later. I was 11 years old, visiting my grandmother's farm in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. She had this big old farmhouse that had been in the family for generations. We'd go there a few times a year, but the fall visits were always my favorite. The leaves would be changing, the air had that crisp smell to it, and there was always hot apple cider waiting for us kids when we came in from playing outside. That particular weekend, a bunch of my cousins were there too. My aunt and uncle lived about an hour away, and they'd brought their 3 kids. We were all around the same age and got along pretty well, even though we only saw each other a few times a year. After lunch that Saturday, we were bored and decided to play hide and seek. My cousin Jake was it first, and the rest of us scattered. The property was perfect for hiding. There was the big red barn, a couple of sheds, tall grass, and woods surrounding everything. My grandmother had about 40 acres total, though most of it was either woods or fields that had been left to grow wild after my grandfather passed away in '89. I remember thinking I wanted to find the perfect hiding spot, somewhere no one would think to look. I'd always been competitive, and I wanted to win this round. I ran past the barn, which was the obvious choice, and headed up this gravel road that led away from the main house. About 200 yards up was this old corn crib that nobody really used anymore. The corn crib was this wooden structure, maybe 15 feet long and 8 feet wide. It had slats along the sides with gaps between them for airflow, originally designed to store and dry corn. It was pretty run down by '96. The roof was missing some shingles and the wood was weathered grey. It sat by itself at the edge of what used to be a cornfield, but had been left fallow for years. I'd only been in it once before, the previous summer, when my grandma was showing me around the property. It was kind of creepy even then, with cobwebs everywhere and this musty smell. But that day, it seemed like the perfect hiding spot. I pulled open the door, which creaked so loud I worried they'd hear it all the way back at the house. Inside, it was dim and cool. Light filtered through the slats, casting these weird striped shadows across the dirt floor. There wasn't much in there. Some old burlap sacks in one corner, a rusty pitchfork leaning against the wall, and years of dust and dead leaves that had blown in. I went to the back wall and crouched down. Through the slats, I could see the overgrown field and in the distance, the edge of the woods. I figured I'd be able to spot anyone coming before they saw me. I remember feeling pretty pleased with myself for finding such a good spot. I must have been there for maybe 5 minutes, just listening to the sounds outside. Birds, the occasional gust of wind rustling the tall grass, and the distant shouts of my cousins still playing the game. The air inside was stale and dusty, and I had to stifle a sneeze a couple times. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the old wooden structure settling, but then I realized what I was hearing was breathing, deep, heavy breathing, coming from inside the corn crib with me. My first thought was that one of my cousins had followed me and was trying to scare me. I turned around slowly, expecting to see Jake or one of the others crouched in the shadows. But what I saw wasn't my cousin. It wasn't anyone I knew. It wasn't even human. Standing in the corner, partially hidden in the shadows, was this thing. It was massive, had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and it had these huge, long arms that hung down almost to its knees. The whole body was covered in thick, dark hair. Not fur exactly, more like really coarse human hair, but all over. The color was this deep brown, almost black in the dim light. Its face, though, that's what I remember most clearly. It wasn't quite like an ape, but definitely not human either. The skin around the face was this grayish, leathery color. It had a really flat, wide nose, and these eyes, they were deep set under a heavy brow, and they were looking right at me. I couldn't tell what color they were in the shadows, but they reflected the little bit of light coming through the slats. We just stared at each other. It was breathing heavily through its nose and slightly open mouth. I could see teeth, not fangs or anything, just big, yellowish teeth. The smell was overwhelming, like a wet dog mixed with mud, and something worse, like the hog pen at the county fair, but 10 times stronger. It made my eyes water. I couldn't move. I literally could not make my muscles work. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and I felt this cold sweat break out all over my body. I remember thinking very clearly, this is how I die. I was absolutely certain of it. The creature didn't move toward me though, it just stood there breathing. Maybe it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Maybe it was trying to figure out what I was going to do. Looking back, it almost seemed curious rather than aggressive. But that didn't matter to my 11-year-old brain. All I knew was pure terror. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. It could have been 10 seconds or 2 minutes. Time just stopped making sense. But then something broke the spell. A shout from one of my cousins in the distance calling my name. That sound snapped me out of my paralysis. Without thinking, I bolted, I turned and ran for the door faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I half expected to feel those massive hands grab me from behind, but nothing happened. I burst out of the corn crib and just ran down that gravel road toward the farmhouse. I was crying and screaming, though I don't remember making any sound. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back once, I just ran. By the time I reached the house, I realized I'd wet myself. My jeans were soaked, and I was sobbing uncontrollably. My mom was the first one to see me come tearing into the yard. She ran out to meet me, asking what happened if I was hurt. I tried to tell her about the monster in the corn crib, but I was hyperventilating so badly she couldn't understand me. My uncle came over to see what the commotion was about. When my mom finally got me calmed down enough to explain, and I told them about the giant hairy creature, my uncle just laughed. "Sounds like you found old Jenkins' scarecrow," he said. "He puts one up every year to keep the deer out of his soybean field." But Jenkins' farm was miles away, and what I saw wasn't a scarecrow. I knew the difference. It was alive. It was breathing. It was looking at me. My mom was more sympathetic, but I could tell she thought I'd just scared myself. She took me inside to get cleaned up while my uncle rounded up my cousins to tell them the game was over. I heard him telling my grandmother that I'd let my imagination run wild and got spooked by shadows or a raccoon or something. No one believed me. Why would they? An 11-year-old boy claiming he saw a monster in an old corn crib. It sounded like something straight out of a campfire story. The rest of that weekend was awful. My cousins teased me mercilessly about being scared and peeing my pants. The adults kept exchanging these looks whenever I was around, like they were worried about me. I refused to go outside for the rest of the visit, which only made everyone think I was being dramatic. On the drive home Sunday evening, my dad tried to have a rational conversation with me about how our minds can play tricks on us when we're scared or in dark places. He talked about how raccoons and bears can sometimes stand on their hind legs and look bigger than they are. He wasn't angry or anything, just concerned, I think. But I knew what I saw wasn't a raccoon or a bear or a scarecrow. For years afterward, whenever we visited my grandmother, I refused to go anywhere near that side of the property. I'd make up excuses or just flat out refuse. Eventually, everyone chalked it up to one of those weird childhood things, and they stopped bringing it up. The corn crib itself collapsed during a heavy snowstorm a few years later, and my grandmother had the remains cleared away. As I got older, I started researching. This was before the internet was big, so I'd go to the library and look up local folklore, wildlife reports, anything I could find. It wasn't until I was in high school that I came across a book about Bigfoot sightings in the Appalachian region. The descriptions matched what I'd seen: the height, the build, the dark hair, even the face with its leathery skin and deep-set eyes. There had been reports in Fayette County going back decades. Not a lot, but enough to make me realize I wasn't alone. Some loggers in '83, a hunter in '78, a family camping in '92, all described seeing something similar to what I encountered. I'm 38 now, with kids of my own. I've never taken them to that part of my grandmother's property, even though the corn crib is long gone. I still get this sick feeling in my stomach whenever I think about standing there, looking into those eyes. I've told my wife about it, And to her credit, she doesn't dismiss it outright. She knows me well enough to know I'm not making it up or exaggerating, but she's never quite believed it either. How could she? I wouldn't believe it if someone told me the same story. But I know what I saw that day. I know it wasn't a bear or a person in a costume or my imagination. Whatever was in that corn crib was real. It was breathing, watching, thinking, and sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere in those woods it still thinks about the small, terrified boy who stumbled into its hiding place on a fall afternoon in '96. Story 12. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. It happened over 20 years ago, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've only told a few close friends and family members because I know how it sounds, but I swear on everything I care about, this really happened. It was late September in 1999. I was working construction on a cabin site up in the mountains above Huntsville. The commute was killing me, almost 2 hours each way, so I decided to camp on the property while I finished the excavation work. My 7-year-old son, Tyler, was on fall break from school that week, so I brought him along. He was always begging to come to work with me, and I figured it would be a good father-son experience. The property owner had cleared a flat spot for camping, and we set up a decent little site with a tent, some basic supplies, and a fire pit. The first 4 days went smoothly. I'd work on the excavation during the day, while Tyler explored nearby, always within shouting distance. And in the evenings, we'd fish at a small pond about half a mile from our camp. It was actually pretty perfect. Beautiful weather, good fishing, and quality time with my boy. On the 5th day, I wrapped up work earlier than usual, around 4 in the afternoon. Tyler had been asking to take the 4-wheeler deeper into the property, so I figured we had enough daylight left for a quick ride. I'd brought my Honda 4-Trax along specifically for this purpose, to explore the area when work was done. Ready for that ride I promised? I asked Tyler. His face lit up instantly. That kid loved riding more than anything. We strapped on our helmets, loaded a small backpack with water and snacks, and set off up one of the mountain roads. It was a gorgeous afternoon, not too hot, not too cold, with that crisp mountain air that just makes you feel alive. The kind of perfect fall day that makes you glad to be outdoors. As we rode, I kept checking my watch. The sun would be setting soon, and I didn't want to be out in unfamiliar territory after dark. We followed an old logging road that wound through dense pines and aspen groves, climbing higher up the mountain. Tyler sat in front of me, occasionally pointing at deer or interesting rock formations. It was peaceful, normal. After about 45 minutes of riding, I noticed the sun dipping behind the ridge. The shadows were growing longer, and the temperature was dropping quickly. That's how it is in the mountains. Once the sun starts setting, darkness comes fast, and it gets cold in a hurry. We should head back soon, bud, I told Tyler, and he nodded in agreement. We continued just a bit further, until we found a flat clearing that looked like an old campsite, perfect for turning around. There was a fallen log, a stone-ringed fire pit that hadn't been used in years, and an old fence line running along the edge where the clearing met the trees. The place had an eerie quietness to it that I didn't notice right away. I stopped the 4-wheeler and let it idle as I checked my watch again. It was almost 7. The sun had just disappeared behind the mountains, leaving that dusky half-light that makes everything look slightly different, slightly off. This is our turnaround point, I said, preparing to swing the 4-wheeler around. It'll be dark soon. That's when it happened. I felt Tyler's small hand tapping urgently on my shoulder. At first, I thought he needed to use the bathroom or something, but when I looked down at him, his face had gone completely pale. His eyes were wide with fear, fixed on something in the distance. He was trying to speak, but no words came out. Finally, he just pointed toward the tree line along the old fence. Following his gaze, I froze. About 50 feet away, partially obscured by the growing shadows, Something was walking along the fence line, something huge. It was moving upright on two legs, with a smooth, deliberate gait that was unsettlingly purposeful. My first thought was bear, but I dismissed it immediately. No bear moves like that. This thing was walking fully upright, with a fluid, almost human-like motion, but it was no human. It stood at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8, with a massive frame covered in what appeared to be dark, matted hair or fur. The light was fading fast, but I could make out its silhouette clearly against the lighter background of a clearing beyond the trees. It had an enormous, bulky upper body, thick through the chest and shoulders in a way that no normal person could ever be. Its arms were unnaturally long, swinging loosely at its sides as it walked, with hands that seemed to reach almost to its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God for that, but I could tell its head sat directly on those massive shoulders, with little or no neck visible. It moved with a confident, unhurried stride, taking long steps that covered ground alarmingly quickly, despite its casual pace. The most terrifying part was that it seemed completely unaware of us. Or if it was aware, it didn't care. It just continued its steady walk along the fence line, neither speeding up nor slowing down. There was something deeply unnerving about that indifference, as if we were so insignificant that we didn't warrant even a glance. I don't know how long we sat there watching it, probably only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Tyler had pressed himself back against me, trembling. I could feel his rapid breathing. Neither of us made a sound. The creature reached the end of the visible fence line and, without breaking stride, simply stepped off the path and disappeared into the denser woods. The entire sighting probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it's burned into my memory forever. The moment it vanished from view, my paralysis broke. Pure survival instinct took over. I gunned the four-wheeler's engine and spun us around so fast that Tyler almost fell off. I gripped him tightly with one arm while steering with the other, and we tore back down that mountain road like hell itself was chasing us. I didn't slow down once during that entire ride back. Every shadow in the trees looked like a monster. Every rustle in the bushes sounded like footsteps. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt oppressive and threatening. The growing darkness only made it worse, making familiar landmarks look alien and wrong. When we finally reached our campsite, it was almost completely dark. I immediately set about building the biggest fire I could manage, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike the matches. Tyler hadn't spoken a single word since the encounter. He just sat on a log, staring into the trees, jumping at every noise. "It's okay, buddy," I kept saying, though we both knew it wasn't. "We're safe now." Once I had the fire roaring, I'm talking massive, using every piece of firewood we had, I pulled Tyler close and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "Did you see that too?" I asked him, partly hoping he'd say no, that it was just my imagination. He nodded slowly. "The monster," he whispered. I wanted to tell him there were no monsters, that it was probably just a bear or a moose seen in bad light. That's what a good father would say, right? But I couldn't bring myself to lie. What we'd seen wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't anything I could explain. "I think it was a Bigfoot," Tyler said suddenly, his voice small but certain. The word hung in the air between us. Bigfoot. I'd always laughed at those stories, thought they were tall tales told by drunk hunters or attention seekers. But now I wasn't laughing. Neither of us slept much that night. I kept the fire blazing until dawn, feeding it constantly, my rifle across my lap. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me pointing the flashlight into the darkness, expecting to see those same long arms, that same massive silhouette. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. I can't explain it, but throughout that endless night, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there in the darkness, observing us. Several times I thought I heard heavy footsteps circling our camp just beyond the firelight's reach. Maybe it was just my imagination working overtime, but Tyler heard it too. I could tell by the way he tensed up and pressed closer to me each time. When morning finally came, I packed up our camp in record time. We had 2 more days scheduled to finish the excavation work, but there was no way we were spending another night up there. I told the property owner some family emergency had come up, and we left before noon. Looking back now, I regret not turning toward the creature for a better look. Fear overwhelmed any curiosity I might have had, but at the same time, I'm grateful we didn't get a clearer view. Something tells me seeing its face might have haunted us even more than the glimpse we did get. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters since then. I've read books, joined online forums, even attended a conference once. I've heard enough similar stories to know we're not alone in what we saw. But I've never found a completely satisfying explanation. Tyler's 16 now, and he still remembers that day clearly. We don't talk about it much, but sometimes when we're camping in other areas, I'll catch him scanning the tree line with that same wary look. The experience changed us both, changed how we see the wilderness, changed what we believe is possible. I don't know what we saw that evening in the mountains above Huntsville. I can't explain it. But I know what we didn't see. We didn't see a bear. We didn't see a man in a costume. And we didn't see any known animal that's supposed to exist in those mountains. Whatever it was, moved with a confidence and purpose that still chills me to this day. Sometimes I wonder if it's still up there, walking those same forest paths as the sun goes down. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I could swear I hear those same heavy, unhurried footsteps passing by my window. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. It happened almost 6 years ago now, but I still think about it constantly. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy, but my mom saw it too, and she's the most level-headed person I know. This happened in early August of 2017. I'd been having a rough summer, just broke up with my girlfriend of 3 years, and was feeling pretty down. My mom suggested we take a day trip out to Lake Billy Chinook in central Oregon to clear my head. It's beautiful out there, these massive canyon walls surrounding this blue-green water. We used to go camping there when I was younger, so it held good memories. I brought my Remington 700 with me because I wanted to sight in the new scope I'd just bought. Nothing fancy, just a Vortex 3-9 power that I'd picked up on sale. I figured I'd do some target practice while we were out there, since there are plenty of secluded spots where you can safely shoot. We drove out early that morning, maybe around 7 a.m. It was already getting hot, one of those August days where you can feel the heat building. We found this secluded little inlet on the eastern shore of the lake where I'd shot before. There weren't any other boats or people around, which was perfect. I set up a few targets on this mud bank about 100 yards from where we parked. The spot was ideal because the bank served as a natural backstop for the bullets. My mom decided to walk down to the water's edge while I worked on sighting in my rifle. She's not really into shooting, but she's always supported my hunting. I spent maybe an hour making tiny adjustments to the scope, firing, checking the grouping, adjusting again. It was peaceful out there with just the occasional crack of the rifle echoing off the canyon walls. After I got the scope dialed in just right, I packed up my gear and walked down to join my mom by the water. She was sitting on this flat rock, just watching the water and the fish jumping occasionally. We chatted for a bit about nothing important, just enjoying being away from town and all the drama back home. After a while, I mentioned wanting to check the hillside behind us for deer sign. There was this small ditch running between where we were and a hill covered in pine and juniper, and I'd seen deer there before in previous trips. "I'll just be gone a few minutes," I told her. "I want to see if there are any fresh tracks up there." She nodded and said she'd stay by the water. It was around 5 in the afternoon by then, still plenty of light, but getting toward that golden hour when the sun starts to drop. I grabbed my rifle, force of habit really, and hiked up past the ditch to the base of the hill. The ground was pretty dry, but there were patches of softer dirt where you could see tracks if animals had passed through. I was crouched down, looking at what might have been a deer print when I heard this whistle. It was high-pitched, but not like any bird I'd ever heard before. It almost sounded deliberate, like someone trying to get someone else's attention, you know? But we were alone out there. At least I thought we were. I stood up and looked around, but didn't see anything unusual, just the trees and brush. I was about to go back to looking for tracks when I felt a tap on my shoulder that nearly made me jump out of my skin. It was my mom. She'd hiked up from the shore to find me, and she looked concerned. "Logan," she said, her voice quiet but tense. "There's someone by the car." I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? Did they drive up?" She shook her head. "No, they're just standing there, watching us, I think." Now, my mom isn't the type to get spooked easily. She grew up in rural Montana and has encountered everything from bears to mountain lions without losing her cool. So when I saw the look on her face, I felt this cold feeling in my stomach. "Let's go check it out," I said, trying to sound confident. The sun was getting lower now, and the shadows were stretching across the landscape. The temperature was dropping too, that quick cooling that happens in the desert as day turns to dusk. We started making our way back toward the car, which was maybe 300 yards away through some fairly thick brush. I kept my rifle ready, not pointed at anything, but definitely not slung over my shoulder either. As we got closer to the car, maybe 20 yards away, this smell hit us. I can't even describe how awful it was, like a broken toilet or an old outhouse in the heat, mixed with something rotten and musky. It was so strong it made my eyes water. "Jesus," I muttered, covering my nose with my shirt. "What is that?" My mom looked terrified now. "Logan, I don't see anyone anymore." That's when I made a decision. I raised my rifle and fired 2 shots into the air. Not at anything, just warning shots. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing back and forth until it faded. As soon as the echo died, we heard it. Heavy footsteps running through the brush, moving away from us toward the ditch I'd been at earlier. Whatever it was big and fast. The brush was crashing and snapping, and then there was this loud thump like something heavy had jumped or fallen into the ditch. "Run," I told my mom, and we both sprinted the last 20 yards to the car. My mom reached it first and yanked open the passenger door. I was right behind her, but as she was getting in, I heard this sound that still gives me nightmares. It was this rough, guttural noise, part deep breathing, part... I don't know how to describe it. Almost like a voice, but lower and harsher than any human voice I've ever heard. It was coming from the direction of the ditch. I jumped into the driver's seat, threw my rifle in the back, and started the car with shaking hands. We peeled out of there, dirt flying everywhere. I didn't slow down until we hit the main road, maybe 2 miles away. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. My mom was silent for a long moment. "I saw it, Logan," she finally said. "When I came to get you, it was standing by the car, just watching. I thought it was a person at first, but what?" I asked, glancing over at her. She looked pale. "It was too big to be a person," she said quietly. "It had this reddish-brown hair all over it, and these shoulders, they were so thick. It must have been 7 feet tall at least." I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warmth of the evening. "Like a bear standing up?" I suggested, trying to find a rational explanation. She shook her head firmly. "No, it was standing upright the whole time, like a person, but not a person." We drove home mostly in silence, both trying to process what had happened. Over the next few days, I started doing some research, and everything pointed to one conclusion I'd never seriously considered before. We had encountered a Sasquatch. The more I thought about it, the more other strange things I'd experienced in that area over the years started to make sense. The oddly twisted pine trees I'd seen that looked like something massive had bent them, The times I'd heard what sounded like heavy objects being thrown through the treetops when camping, and that smell. I'd caught whiffs of it before on other trips, but never as strong as that day. I've been back to Lake Billy Chinook a few times since then, but I never go without my rifle, and I never stay past dusk. And if I catch even the slightest hint of that rotten smell, I leave immediately. My mum and I don't talk about it much anymore. What's the point? Nobody would believe us anyway. But sometimes when we're together and the conversation lulls, I can tell she's thinking about it too. About what we saw standing by our car that August evening in 2017, about what chased us away from that peaceful spot by the lake. I still don't know what to make of it all. All I know is what we experienced was real, and it changed how I see the forests of Central Oregon forever. Whatever was watching us that day, it wasn't human. And sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching other unsuspecting visitors from the trees. Story 14. I never thought I'd be sharing this. For years I've kept it mostly to myself, telling only my brother and a couple of close friends. But I need to put it down somewhere, and maybe someone here will understand or have seen something similar. I've spent my entire life in the forests of northern Minnesota, 62 years on this earth, and 43 of those working forestry. I know every tree species, every animal track, every sound the woods make in all 4 seasons. I've seen black bears up close, had moose cross my path, watched wolves from a distance. The forest has no secrets from me. At least that's what I thought until August of 2016. White Spruce Lake has always been my getaway spot. It's fairly isolated, about a 2-hour drive from my cabin, then another 45 minutes on foot to reach the shore. Not many people bother with it because the fishing is just okay, not great, and there are easier lakes to access. But I've always valued the solitude there. That morning I loaded my old aluminum canoe onto my truck before sunrise. The weather forecast called for clear skies, temperatures in the mid-70s, perfect conditions. I packed a simple lunch, my tackle box, 2 fishing rods, and enough water to last the day. I've done this routine hundreds of times. I reached the lake around 8 in the morning. The water was dead calm like glass, reflecting the pine trees surrounding it. That's one thing I always loved about white spruce. On quiet days, the reflection is so perfect it looks like the world has doubled. I unloaded my canoe, carried it to the water's edge, and pushed off. For about 3 hours, I just fished. Caught 2 decent northern pike and a small bass, nothing worth keeping. The sun climbed higher, warming my shoulders. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how this was exactly where I belonged. Funny how life gives you these perfect moments right before turning everything upside down. It must have been around 11:30 when I first noticed the movement along the eastern shoreline. I was about 200 yards from shore, my canoe drifting lazily after I'd paddled to what I considered a good fishing spot. At first, I just caught a glimpse of something brown moving between the trees. My first thought was deer. They often come down to the water around midday, but then it stepped fully into the clearing, and I knew immediately it wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear either. Bears don't stand on 2 legs for that long, and they certainly don't move the way this thing moved. I remember setting my fishing rod down very slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements or sounds. I just stared. The creature, and I have no other word for it, was tall. Really tall. I'm 6 feet myself, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, more like long hair that hung from its body. The hair seemed thicker on its shoulders and down its back, thinner on its chest and face. It moved with this strange, powerful confidence, each step deliberate, heavy. Even from that distance I could tell it weighed a lot, at least 400 pounds, probably more. The way it carried itself wasn't like any animal I'd seen before. It wasn't lumbering like a bear. It walked upright with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I sat completely still in my canoe, barely breathing. I was out in the open water with nowhere to hide. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my ears. But the creature didn't seem to notice me, or if it did, it didn't care. What happened next is what I can't explain, what I still see when I close my eyes at night. The creature walked straight to the water's edge. Without hesitation, it waded in, the water reaching its knees, then its thighs, then its waist. I expected it to stop, but it kept going. Then it started swimming. I've been around water my whole life. I've seen deer swim, bears swim, moose swim, but this was different. It used a deliberate motion, almost like a breaststroke. Its massive arms extended forward, then pulled back in powerful sweeps. Its head and shoulders stayed above the waterline the entire time. Occasionally, it would tilt its face downward, like it was looking at something beneath the surface, but it never fully submerged. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the sides of the canoe to steady them. Part of me wanted to paddle away as fast as possible, but a stronger part knew that sudden movement might attract attention. So I just sat there, watching, as this creature, this Bigfoot, because what else could it be, swam across the lake with powerful, efficient strokes. It wasn't swimming directly toward me, thank God. Instead, it angled toward the center of the lake, then gradually turned toward the western shore. I tracked its movement the entire time, estimating it swam nearly half a mile without showing any signs of tiring. The strength required to do that. It was incredible and terrifying at the same time. When it reached the shallower water near the opposite shore, it stood up. Water cascaded off its body, revealing the full breadth of its chest and shoulders. They were massive, far wider than any humans. It shook itself, exactly like a dog would, sending water flying in all directions. The sunlight caught the spray, creating a momentary rainbow around this impossible creature. Then it stepped fully onto the shore, water still dripping from its hair, and without looking back, disappeared into the trees. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. I sat in my canoe for a long time afterward, not moving, barely breathing. My mind kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a man in a suit. But no, that made no sense. Nobody would wear a suit like that in August, and nobody could swim that powerfully while wearing something so bulky, a bear standing unusually upright. But I've seen countless bears, and this moved nothing like one. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear, the long arms, the upright posture, the flat face. When I finally convinced myself to move again, my hands were still shaking. I reeled in my fishing line and started paddling toward my launch point, making a wide arc to avoid crossing the creature's swimming path. The whole time, I kept glancing toward the western shore, half expecting it to emerge again. I packed up faster than I ever have before. The canoe scraped against my truck as I hastily secured it, something I'd normally never do. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, listening for any unusual sounds. The forest that had always been my sanctuary suddenly felt alien and dangerous. The drive home is mostly a blur. I remember stopping at a gas station and catching my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide. The attendant asked if I was feeling okay. I mumbled something about catching a stomach bug and left quickly. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I'd jolt awake at the slightest sound outside my cabin. I found myself researching Bigfoot sightings in Minnesota, something I'd always scoffed at before. I discovered there have been dozens of reported sightings in the northern counties over the years. Some of the descriptions matched exactly what I saw. The height, the color, the way it moved. Growing up in Minnesota, I'd heard Bigfoot stories my whole life. Like most people, I dismissed them as campfire tales or misidentifications. Bears standing up, moose glimpsed through fog, people's minds playing tricks on them in the wilderness. I never gave them any real credence. Now I don't know what to believe anymore, except that I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't a person, and the swimming. That's what sticks with me the most. The grace of it, the power, the obvious comfort in the water. Nothing in any Bigfoot story I'd ever heard mentioned swimming abilities like that. I've gone back to White Spruce Lake only twice since then, and never alone. Both times I couldn't focus on fishing. My eyes kept scanning the shoreline, looking for movement, for that distinctive silhouette. I didn't see anything unusual again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The few people I've told have had mixed reactions. My brother believes me. He knows I'm not one for tall tales or exaggerations. One friend suggested I might have had heat stroke or some kind of hallucination. Another asked if I'd been drinking. I hadn't, never do when I'm on the water. Most just listen politely and change the subject. I understand their skepticism. If someone had told me this story 6 years ago, I'd have been skeptical too. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. There are things in these forests that defy explanation, that exist despite our disbelief. Sometimes at night, I still see it in my mind. That massive figure cutting through the water with those powerful strokes, water streaming off its body as it emerged on the distant shore. I've spent my life in these woods, thought I knew every creature that called them home. Now I realize how little I really know, how much mystery still remains in places we think we understand. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but it happened. And sometimes, when I hear unusual sounds outside my cabin at night, I wonder if it's out there, moving through the trees, perhaps remembering the human it saw that day, just as clearly as I remember seeing it. Story 15. I've never been a huge believer in the paranormal or cryptids or whatever. I mean, I watch those shows sometimes and get a kick out of them, but I never thought I'd have my own story to tell. It's been over 6 years now since it happened, and I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in Cherokee National Forest. This was back in spring of 2017. My wife Melissa and I had been trying to get my sister Amanda and her 2 kids, they were 7 and 9 at the time, to come camping with us for ages. Amanda was always hesitant about overnight camping. She's more of a glamping type person, if I'm honest. She'd rather have a cabin with running water and electricity than rough it in a tent. But we finally convinced her to join us, mainly because her kids were begging to go on a real adventure with Uncle James and Aunt Melissa. We found this perfect little clearing near a quiet lake in Cherokee National Forest, Tennessee. It wasn't too deep in the woods, maybe a quarter mile from where we parked the cars, right off this old footpath. I picked the spot specifically because it wasn't too wild for Amanda's first camping experience. We could still see the road from our campsite if we looked hard enough through the trees, which I thought would make her feel safer. We brought our 2 dogs with us, my old lab mix Rex, who was about 12 at the time, and our younger pit mix, Sadie, who was only about 2 years old. Sadie was a rescue, but she'd turned into this incredibly loyal, fearless dog. I'd seen her chase off a black bear from our bird feeders once without hesitation. Rex was older, but still alert. He'd bark if anyone came near our property back home. We got to the site around 2 in the afternoon and set everything up. 2 tents, one for Amanda and the kids, and one for Melissa and me. We put the tents about 15 feet apart with a fire pit in between. It was one of those perfect spring days, not too hot, with a light breeze. The kids collected firewood while Amanda nervously checked for poison ivy every 5 minutes. Melissa cooked these amazing foil packet dinners over the fire, and we made s'mores after dark. Normal camping stuff, you know. By around 11 that night, everyone was tired. The kids were practically falling asleep sitting up, so Amanda took them into their tent. Melissa went to bed not long after, and I stayed up a bit longer to make sure the fire was completely out. I'm always paranoid about forest fires. I remember checking my watch as I finally crawled into our tent. It was just past 11:30. I don't know if you've ever tried to sleep on the ground in a tent, but it's not exactly the Hilton. I was lying there on my sleeping bag, listening to Melissa's soft breathing beside me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. The dogs were with us. Rex was curled up at our feet, and Sadie was pressed against my side like she always does. Everything was quiet except for the normal night sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. Footsteps. Not like a deer picking its way through the underbrush, or a raccoon shuffling around looking for scraps. These were heavy, deliberate. Something with weight was walking through the woods, maybe 30 or 40 yards from our campsite. At first, I thought maybe it was another camper, but it was nearly 1 in the morning according to my watch, and we hadn't seen anyone else in this area. Plus, the footsteps didn't sound right. They were too heavy, too widely spaced. I've been hiking and camping my whole life, and I know what humans sound like moving through the woods. This wasn't that. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. Whatever it was heading straight for our campsite. That's when I noticed Sadie. This dog who fearlessly chased off a bear was trembling against me, making this low, whimpering sound I'd never heard from her before. Rex was awake too, his head raised, ears perked up, but he wasn't barking. He was just watching, like he was waiting for something. The footsteps came closer, reaching the edge of our clearing. I could hear branches breaking under its weight. Then the footsteps changed direction, moving toward Amanda's tent. My heart nearly stopped. My sister and her kids were in there, and this, whatever it was heading right for them. I wanted to get up, to grab the flashlight and the hatchet we'd brought for splitting kindling, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed with fear, pinned to the ground by some primal instinct that said if I moved, if I made any sound at all, it would be worse. So I just lay there, listening as the footsteps circled Amanda's tent, slow, methodical, like it was inspecting every inch. I could hear Sadie's whimpering getting louder, and I put my hand over her muzzle, afraid she'd draw attention to our tent. Rex was still eerily silent, which scared me even more. That dog barks if a leaf blows across our yard at home, but here he was, completely quiet in the face of whatever was out there. The footsteps continued around Amanda's tent, and then I heard my sister's voice, just a whisper through the darkness. "James, is that you out there?" My blood turned to ice. I wanted to call out, to tell her to stay absolutely still and quiet, but my voice wouldn't work. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to whisper back, just loud enough for her to hear me. "No, I'm in my tent, don't move." There was silence from her tent after that. The footsteps paused when I whispered, and for a horrible moment, I thought it had heard me and was now turning its attention to our tent. But then it continued its circuit around Amanda's tent, completing a full circle before stopping again. I strained my ears, trying to hear any sound that might tell me what this thing was doing. Was it just standing there, watching the tent? Was it reaching for the zipper? I don't think I've ever been more terrified in my life than in those moments, lying there in the dark, waiting. Then came the sound of sniffing, loud, powerful inhalations of air, like something was trying to catch our scent. It moved again, taking a few steps toward our tent, and I felt Melissa stir beside me. She whispered, "What's wrong with Sadie?" Noticing the dogs trembling, I just squeezed her hand hard, willing her to be quiet. The thing took another step toward our tent, and I swear I could feel its presence looming over us, separated only by the thin fabric of the tent. Sadie was shaking so hard now, it was like she was having a seizure. Even Rex had crawled further down into the corner of the tent, as far from the entrance as he could get. Just when I thought it was going to tear into our tent, the footsteps retreated, slowly at first, then faster, moving back into the forest the way it had come. The sound faded into the distance, punctuated by the crack of breaking branches as it moved away. I lay there, barely breathing, listening for any sign that it might return. Minutes stretched into hours, every snap of a twig, Every rustle of leaves in the distance made my heart race all over again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, one arm around Melissa and the other hand on Sadie, who never stopped trembling until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When morning finally came, I was the first one out of the tent. I searched the area around both tents, looking for tracks or any sign of what had visited us in the night. But the ground was too covered with pine needles and leaves to show clear footprints. The kids came bouncing out of their tent like nothing had happened, excited for breakfast and more adventures. But Amanda looked as exhausted as I felt, with dark circles under her eyes and a haunted look on her face. We didn't talk about it then. We packed up quickly after breakfast and headed home, making excuses about the weather looking bad later that day. It wasn't until a month later that Amanda finally brought it up. We were having a beer on my back porch after the kids had gone to bed, and she just turned to me and said, "I know what was out there that night. It was walking on two legs, James. Two legs." She didn't need to say anything more. I knew exactly what she meant, because I'd been thinking the same thing for weeks. Whatever circled our tents that night in Cherokee National Forest wasn't a bear or a deer or any other normal forest animal. It was something bipedal, something big enough to make the ground shake slightly with each step, something smart enough to inspect our campsite methodically. That was 6 years ago. Melissa and I still go hiking and camping. We even run the forest trails regularly. There's this beautiful 5-mile loop not far from where we camped that day. But there's this one stretch of the trail, a swampy area with dense underbrush, where I always feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes I hear wood knocking in the distance, like someone striking a tree with a heavy stick. I never stop in that section anymore. I just run through as fast as I can, with the dogs close by my side. I've talked to a few other people who've had similar experiences in those woods. A woman who saw a large, hairy creature cross the road near Toledo River around dusk. A hunter from Pennsylvania who told me about a tall, dark figure that stood watching him from between the trees for nearly 10 minutes before melting away into the forest. I still go into the woods. I still love the outdoors. But I keep my dogs closer now, and I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way I never was before. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the wind is moving through the trees outside our window, I remember the sound of those footsteps circling my sister's tent, and I know without a doubt that there was a Sasquatch moving through the Tennessee wilderness that night. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting for the next group of campers to pitch their tents in its territory. Story 16. I've never really talked about this with anyone outside my family. It's been on my mind lately, though, especially since my sister and I were planning a camping trip for next month, and she flat out refused to go anywhere near Stockport. Can't blame her, honestly. This happened back in 2003 when I was 11. My family had this tradition of camping along the Muskingum River every summer. My dad knew all these spots from when he was growing up. He'd take me, my mom, and my little sister Emma, she was 6 at the time, for weekend trips. We'd fish, swim, roast marshmallows. Typical family stuff. That particular weekend in July started off normally enough. We packed up our old blue Dodge Caravan with all our gear, tents, coolers, fishing poles, the usual camping stuff. We got a late start though. Dad had to work longer than expected, and then we hit traffic leaving Columbus. By the time we got near Stockport, it was already getting dark. Dad was annoyed because we'd missed setting up camp before sunset, which was always his rule. Never set up camp in the dark, he'd say. But we were stuck. We had 2 options: find a motel or rough it somehow until morning. Being stubborn and cheap, Dad chose option 2. We ended up parking at this pull-off area at the top of this ridge overlooking the river. There were these old abandoned cabins nearby. Nothing creepy, just some old hunting cabins that had fallen into disrepair. Dad said we'd sleep in the van that night and head down to our usual spot by the river in the morning. I remember being disappointed. Sleeping in the van meant no campfire, no s'mores. Mom rearranged stuff so Emma and I could stretch out in the back, while she and Dad reclined the front seats. It was uncomfortable, but I eventually fell asleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just because I had to pee, which sucked because I'd have to go outside in the dark. But then I realized what had actually woken me: noise from the woods behind us. It wasn't like normal nighttime forest sounds, those I was used to. Crickets, owls, whatever. This was different. It sounded like something big was moving through the trees. There was this distinct sound of heavy branches snapping. Not twigs, but actual branches. The kind of sounds that only something really heavy could make. I nudged my dad, but he just mumbled something and rolled over. The sounds continued for maybe another 10 minutes, then stopped. I lay there wide awake for what felt like forever, before finally falling back asleep. The next morning, nobody mentioned anything unusual. Dad was eager to get down to our regular campsite by the river. We packed up quickly, had some granola bars for breakfast, and drove down this steep, winding gravel road that connected the ridge to the riverside. Our usual spot was this nice flat area about 50 yards from the water, surrounded by trees on 3 sides. It was perfect, secluded, but with enough open space for our tents and a fire pit. Dad and I started unloading while Mom and Emma went to scope out the best place for the tents. Dad suddenly stopped and squinted at something near this dry creek bed that ran from the hillside down to the river. "Danny, come check this out," he called to me. I walked over, and that's when I saw it. There in the dried mud was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This thing was massive, easily 18 inches long. It had 5 toes, clearly defined, pressed deep into the ground. The impression was so deep that whatever made it had to be incredibly heavy. "What made that?" I asked, though I already had this sick feeling in my stomach. Dad knelt down beside it, placing his hand next to it for scale. His entire hand barely covered the heel portion. "Bear, maybe," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We both knew bears don't have feet shaped like that. This looked human, just way, way bigger. "Should we go?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. Dad hesitated, then shook his head. "Nah, it's probably old. Could have been here for weeks." But I knew it wasn't old. The edges were crisp, not worn down by rain or wind, and there had been a light dew that morning. The inside of the print was still damp, while the surrounding area had dried in the sun. We went back to the campsite, where Mom was helping Emma set up her little folding chair. Dad pulled Mom aside and was quietly telling her about the print when Emma suddenly started crying. Not like she'd hurt herself, but this weird, scared whimpering. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Mom asked, kneeling down beside her. Emma wouldn't speak. She just pointed up the slope behind our campsite. That's when we all turned and saw it. About 70 yards up the hillside, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, was something. Someone. A figure covered in reddish-brown hair or fur. At first I thought maybe it was a person wearing a coat, but it was at least 7 feet tall with impossibly broad shoulders. It was watching us, just standing there, perfectly still, watching our family. "Holy shit," Dad whispered, which scared me more than anything because Dad never swore in front of us. The thing shifted its position slightly, and I could see its arms. They hung way lower than a person should, almost to its knees. Its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders without much of a neck. We all froze, just staring at it. Nobody moved or spoke. It felt like time had stopped. Then, as if sensing our awareness, it moved. It didn't run or charge, it just walked, taking these long, deliberate strides down the hill, moving with this weird, fluid grace that made no sense for something so big. It wasn't heading directly toward us, but toward the gravel road that we'd driven down. "Get in the van," Dad said, his voice steady but tight. "Now." We didn't argue. Mum scooped up Emma, who was still crying silently. I grabbed nothing, left my backpack, my fishing pole, everything, Dad popped the van's hatch and we threw in what little we'd unpacked. The whole time, I kept my eyes on the creature. It had reached the road now and was just standing there, watching us from about 50 yards away. "What is it?" I asked as Dad frantically tried to collapse the tent. "I don't know," he said, which was terrifying because Dad always had answers. We managed to get almost everything in the van in record time. Dad left the folding chairs, said we could buy new ones. We piled in, and Dad started the engine. Here's the part that still gives me nightmares. To leave, we had to drive up that same gravel road that the creature was now standing beside. There was no other way out. As Dad put the van in gear, Mom told us not to look. "Keep your heads down," she said. But of course I looked. I had to. As we approached, the creature didn't move. It just stood at the edge of the trees, watching our van get closer and closer. I could see it more clearly now. Its face was strangely human-like, but with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. Its eyes were dark, not glowing or red like in horror movies, just deep-set and intensely focused. We were maybe 30 feet from it when it finally moved. It turned, almost casually, and walked into the trees, not running, not hiding, just calmly walking away like we weren't worth its time. Dad gunned the engine and we shot up the gravel road, fishtailing slightly on the loose stones. Nobody spoke until we hit the main road. "What the hell was that?" Mom finally asked, her voice shaking. "Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it," Dad said. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I never believed in that stuff, but Emma was curled up against Mom, still silent. I reached over and took her hand, and she squeezed mine so hard it hurt. When we got home, Dad called his friend who worked for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. The guy came out to our house that evening, and they talked for hours in the garage. I tried to eavesdrop, but Dad caught me and sent me to bed. The next day, Dad said we weren't going to report it officially. His friend had advised against it, said we'd either be laughed at or worse, attract all kinds of unwanted attention from the media and Bigfoot hunters. We did go camping again that summer, but nowhere near Stockport. In fact, we never went back to that spot. Dad would always find excuses. The fishing's better at Salt Fork, or let's try somewhere new this year. It wasn't until I was 17 that Dad finally admitted he was too scared to go back there. He said he'd felt watched the entire time, even before we saw the creature. Said his instincts had been screaming at him from the moment we parked on that ridge, but he'd ignored them. I'm 29 now. I've been camping many times since then, all over Ohio and beyond. But I've never been back to Stockport, and I never will. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what we saw. It's how it looked at us, with intelligence, with purpose. It wasn't some animal that stumbled upon us. It knew we were there. It was watching us, studying us, and sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I still get that feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting from behind the trees. Story 17. I still can't fully wrap my head around what I saw last summer. I've replayed it in my mind hundreds of times, trying to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe some guy in a costume. But I know what I saw. I just don't know what to call it. It was the second week of July, one of those scorching California summer days where the heat radiates off the pavement. I was driving back from visiting a buddy who lives out past Berry Creek. I'd left his place around 1 in the afternoon, taking Lumpkin Road west toward Oroville. It's a winding road that cuts through some pretty dense woods, the kind where the trees create these shadows that dance across your windshield. I wasn't in any particular rush. The AC in my 2008 Tacoma was struggling against the heat, and I had the windows cracked to get some airflow. I remember having the radio on low, some classic rock station playing Don't Fear the Reaper, and I was just cruising along, probably doing about 35 miles per hour around those bends. The road there is pretty much empty most of the time. You might pass another car every 20 minutes or so. I like the solitude, honestly. It gives you time to think, to decompress. I'd been stressed about work stuff, and the drive was exactly what I needed to clear my head. I came around this bend. There's this specific curve where the trees open up a bit on the right side before closing back in. And that's when I saw it, about 100 feet ahead of me, crossing directly in my lane. At first glance, my brain tried to categorize it as a person. That's the only thing that made sense. Something walking upright on two legs. But within a split second, I knew this wasn't a person, not even close. It wasn't particularly tall, maybe 5 feet or so, and skinny for its height. But what immediately struck me was that its entire body was covered in this medium brown hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy animal, but uniformly covered. The hair on its arms was longer, and I could see it swinging with each step it took. When I first spotted it, the thing was walking at this easy, natural pace, arms swinging casually, like someone taking a stroll through a park. It was so normal in its movement. That's what was so unsettling. It moved like a person, but it sure as hell wasn't one. I instinctively eased off the gas, my foot hovering between the pedals, unsure whether to brake or speed up. My heart rate shot through the roof. I remember my hands getting clammy on the steering wheel. The creature was about halfway across my lane when it seemed to suddenly realize I was there. There was this moment, this brief, frozen moment, where I swear it turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out a face from that distance, but I felt it look at me. Then everything happened so fast. This thing, which had been walking at a normal pace, suddenly exploded into motion. I've never seen anything move that quickly. It went from a casual stride to what I can only describe as a blur. 2 massive strides, just 2. And it cleared the entire width of the pavement. It launched itself off the shoulder of the road and disappeared into the thick brush. I slammed on my brakes, coming to a stop right where it had jumped off the road. The tires skidded a bit on the hot asphalt, and I sat there, engine idling, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Time felt warped. The radio was still playing, but it was just background noise at that point. My breathing was heavy, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. Eventually, I put the truck in park and got out. The heat hit me like a wall as I stepped onto the pavement. Everything was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine. I walked to the edge of the road where the creature had disappeared. The brush was thick there, a tangle of manzanita, scrub oak and blackberry bushes, creating a dense barrier alongside the road. It would have been nearly impossible for a person to push through without making a ton of noise or leaving obvious signs of passage. I stood there listening, nothing. No rustling, no breaking branches, no sound of something large moving through the underbrush. It was as if this thing had completely melted into the vegetation, like it had never been there at all. I peered into the brush as best I could, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance. The sun was high overhead, casting dappled shadows through the tree canopy, making it hard to see very far into the thicket. I didn't dare step off the road and into that brush tunnel. Something in my gut told me that would be a very bad idea. After a few minutes of staring into the woods and seeing nothing, I got back in my truck. My hands were shaking as I put it in drive. I kept looking in my rearview mirror as I continued toward Oroville, half expecting to see the creature emerge back onto the road behind me. The rest of the drive, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But no, bears don't walk like that. And they certainly don't move that fast on 2 legs. A person in a costume, out here, in the middle of nowhere, in sweltering heat. And no costume would allow someone to move with that kind of speed and agility. I've lived in this area most of my life. I've seen deer, bears, mountain lions, coyotes, all sorts of wildlife. This wasn't any of those. The way it moved on 2 legs, the proportions of its body, the uniform covering of hair, it wasn't anything I could identify. When I got home, I immediately got on my computer and started searching. Bigfoot sightings, Butte County. Hairy creature, Lumpkin Road. Humanoid in Woods, California. Anything I could think of. I found some old reports of Bigfoot sightings in the deeper canyons around here, stories from hunters and hikers who claim to have seen 8-foot-tall creatures with massive frames. But what I saw wasn't like that. This thing was smaller, not much taller than 5 feet. It was lean, almost wiry. If the traditional Bigfoot is real, maybe what I saw was a juvenile, I don't know. All I know is that it moved with incredible purpose and speed once it spotted me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing turning its head toward me, then launching itself off the road. I kept wondering what would have happened if I'd been going faster, if I'd hit it, or worse, what if I'd broken down on that stretch of road and had to walk for help? The next day, I drove back to that same spot. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe, or broken branches where it had crashed through the brush. But there was nothing. The shoulder of the road was hard-packed dirt, not the kind that would hold prints well. The brush looked undisturbed, as thick and impenetrable as ever. I've told a few close friends about what happened. Most of them think I saw a bear, or maybe just a person hiking who got spooked by my car. One suggested it might have been someone living off-grid in the woods who didn't want to be seen, but none of those explanations fit what I witnessed. The speed is what I can't get over. This thing crossed the entire road in 2 strides once it started running. That's not human, not even close. And the way it disappeared, no sound, no trail, nothing. It's like it knew exactly how to move through that environment, like it belonged there in a way humans don't. Since that day, I've been back on Lumpkin Road dozens of times. I always slow down at that curve, always scan the trees and the road ahead. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, just to confirm I'm not crazy. Part of me hopes I never do. I've heard other stories since then. Talking to some of the old-timers at the local diner, I've picked up bits and pieces. Hunters who've had their camps ransacked by something that didn't leave tracks like a bear. Hikers who felt watched in those woods. A couple who swears something kept pace with their car for almost a mile on that same stretch of road, just out of sight in the trees. These hills and canyons are old. There are places back in there where people rarely go, where the forests are thick and the ravines deep. Is it so hard to believe something could live in those spaces, something that knows how to stay hidden, how to move without being seen? I don't know what I saw on Lumpkin Road that summer afternoon, but I know it was real, and I know it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist according to science or common knowledge. It was something else, something that doesn't fit into neat categories or explanations. Sometimes when I'm driving that road now, especially as dusk approaches, I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, for a flash of brown among the green. My window stays firmly rolled up now, even in the heat, and I never, ever stop on that stretch of road anymore. Whatever it was, juvenile Bigfoot, unknown species, or something else entirely, it shares these woods with us. It watches from the shadows while we stick to our roads and trails, thinking we understand the wilderness around us. But that day taught me we don't understand it at all. There are things out there, things that move fast and stay hidden, things that know the forest in ways we never will. And sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky enough, I still haven't decided which, you might catch a glimpse of them as they cross from one shadow to another, momentarily visible in the light, before disappearing back into the world they know, and we don't. That split second on Lumpkin Road changed how I see these woods forever, and no matter how many times people try to explain it away, I know what I saw. I just don't know what to call it.